Oh, now people can hear me. I've been talking to myself for the last 33 seconds. See, this is all a tactic to get you guys to comment. That that is my conspiracy. मैं अपना mic on नहीं किया था. Sorry about that. Okay. No sound, no audio, no sound. Can't hear you. Now I can be heard, right? No, is it not true? Can you hear me? Okay, fine. Roshan K is like, it's fine. Please proceed with your content of today. Just Alan Alexander says Audible. Just now that you've mentioned Audible, I want to mention that I have a podcast on Audible called Comedian in Quarantine Telling Kahaniya. See how subtly I have plugged it. Dekha, this is all a conspiracy to make me plug my show. Okay. Couple of things before we begin. Just want to tell you who's coming up next on Wake Up with Saurabh. On Tuesday, we have a first episode of Wake Up with the IPL, where I'm going to get in comedians and non-comedians, basically people who are cricket fans, to come in, and also people who are not cricket fans, to come in and talk about the IPL and also to make predictions. So first episode is a hardcore cricket fan, Bassi. And because Bassi is coming, I have convinced Shrija to come as well. So it's going to be Bassi and Shrija and also Gaurav Gupta. So I'm very excited about the lineup. It's going to be really, really silly. Thursday, we have Aishwarya Mohan Raj, Sonali Thakkar, and Pavitra. That's also going to be fun. Really fun hang with them. On Saturday, we have Lieutenant General Zamiruddin Shah, retired, who is going to be here to discuss his book and his entire life. It's going to be a fun story. He's written a book called Sarkari Musalman, which is quite interesting, that I'm reading right now. So that's going to be on Saturday, and Sunday, I've forgotten what is happening. Something was happening on Sunday. Again, we've started memberships. If in case you're not aware, I can see already a bunch of members out here. So far, we have about 7,000 members on this channel, guys. 7,000. It might be 15, but we just started. So if you want to be a member, then please do. It's 3 tiers are there. One level is just with emojis and all the badges and stuff. The second level is basically gets you one YouTube live with members per month, which might be two, depending on how many people join, which I think should be a lot. And level 3 gets you 2 comedy open mics per month, including all the benefits above. So just go check it out. It'll be fun. All right. Saurabh has started dressing up now, says Rishabh Agarwal. Please don't start these kind of allegations about my person. I have made no effort as always. Okay. I want my reputation to stay intact. Okay. Before I bring on my guests, just want to introduce them. Okay. Mohak is here. Abhinash has already started super chat, man. What a nice person. Namaste. Sleepless night again just to watch this. I can't find the join button. Is there some issue? I think it should be right there, Minash, right next to right next to the video is join. If somebody can help out Abhinash and explain to him how it works. Okay, I want to introduce my guests for today. And one of them has written a book, has written many books actually. And the one I'm reading right now is, of course, called, I know the name. Okay. I'll have fun with the name once he comes. He's a historian. He's written I mean, he's just about 30 and he's written, I think, 68 books on history. Very interesting man. And also Mohak from Soch, who's also a very interesting man who's released a lot of videos. So without further ado, please bring on your guests for today, Manu S. Pillai and Mohak Mangal. Mohak Mangal. I'm an idiot. Hi.
Mongol.
Mangal, I said. I'm an idiot.
Oh, is Mongol Bengali?
I mean, I'm not Bengali. Maybe there's a Bengali Mongol out there.
The pronunciation sounded Bengali.
It was, I mean, now that we are starting this, and since Manu had claimed that you have a bad joke, which is a good joke.
I did not make any such claims. That was made in private. So we're going to pretend it does not exist.
Okay, so I will make a bad joke, which made me laugh when I was drunk a few days back, where the joke was that there was an old man who used to work in Bollywood, and he was also a wrestler. His name was A.K. Dangal. So on that note, let's end the podcast and never talk again. I just wanna never speak again that this ever happened. Manu, thank you so much for joining us. Mohak, thank you so much for joining us. Big fan of both of you guys. I'm Paul. Apologies for delay. Okay, so the focus is basically going to be about Manu, and Mohak is the one who
Thanks. Told
me that, hey, you should get Manu. Hey, listen, Mohak, this is your idea. You said that we should get Manu and we should talk to him. Okay?
But the idea was for me to be the center of attraction and Manu to ask me questions.
Okay, we can do that also. Done. I have no problems with that. As long as nobody asks me questions.
Far more interesting life.
Yeah. Okay, let's begin. I'll begin with a very basic question that I've been thinking about. I was reading your book, which is called The Courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian uh, what?
Brahmin.
Brahman. There you go. It's my Kindle is not showing the full title right now. On the so I was reading the book, and it's a question that I'm actually constantly curious about with all historians, which is that what is your source material? Like, I'm always curious about where you like how many books do you I mean, again, I'm not how many books do you have to read, but what is your source material to come upon all these stories and essays and all the rest of that stuff?
I mean, all kinds, right? For example, just a few months ago, I was looking at this old poster from the time Tipu Sultan and his father were fighting the British, and we think, this is like we see in our Bollywood movies, these warriors sitting on their horses, looking all noble and about to fight the villainous foreigners. And this was actually a propaganda poster in which you have Hyder Ali spanking an English soldier's bottom, like he's pulled his pants down and he's spanking his bum. And this was real. And when at one of these battles, when the British arrived at the Battle of Srirangapatna, one of these battles, they found that the walls had been scratched clean because there was a lot of graffiti there intended to taunt the British. But then someone decided that it was better to get rid of that before the army actually came. And so your source material, there was a time when people thought that it's merely the inscriptions and the documents, but no, there's art, there's architecture. You find all kinds of curious things in all kinds of places. There's even literature. So, you find, since you mentioned the courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin, the second essay in that is a parody of the caste system written by a Maratha king in the 18th century. So there's comedy, there's parody, there's all kinds of writing, there's all kinds of unwritten sources as well. Art, speaking of Tipu Sultan again, he's done this. If you go to Srirangapatna in his summer palace, there's this huge, humongous mural. And in the mural painting, it basically depicts a 1780 battle that took place at Pullallur between the East India Company and Tipu. And again, it's propaganda because the way Tipu's projected himself, he's sitting on a horse, regally smelling a rose, while all around him it's carnage and bloodshed and, chopped off heads and arms and bodies. And then he depicts the English colonel sitting in a palanquin, which is supposed to suggest effeminacy. He's not on a horse, he's not on an elephant, he's in a palanquin. And the Englishman is chewing his nails. So, it's not really a written record, but that painting is a king trying to communicate something. He's trying to, communicate his own idea of how things should be interpreted. And of course, the British had their own version. So when they, for example, defeated Tipu and took his sons away as hostages, they created all kinds of grand paintings, making it look like some sensational scene, whereas in reality, it happened inside a tent. But in the artwork, there's this magnificent background with the fort, and there's like this, the whole environment is of triumph, whereas in reality, it was a much more modest affair. So, it's paintings, it's literature, it's music sometimes, it's songs, it's all kinds of oral sources, and of course, written sources and so on. So, source material varies depending on what you're doing. And in a country like India, it also comes from multiple languages. So that parody I mentioned on the caste system was written by a Maratha king in Tamil Nadu in the Telugu language. It's just a mixed up universe, even in the 18th century. And it's not easy in India to be a historian because you can't learn all the languages we have. And that's, any historian ideally should be able to go to the primary sources. But in India, that's a humongous challenge because we don't have the capacity to learn all our languages. If we did, we'd unearth so much of importance and so much that is frankly just so inventive and rich and funny and interesting and not at all the dull sort of, textbook version of history that you have.
I mean, I have a follow-up question to exactly this, which is that any event. I mean, even if you take current events that are happening in the world, like if you take the Sushant Singh case, like as a takeoff point, right? There's about 7 different versions of what people believe and have put out into the public domain. So at what stage, and even with regard to history, and specifically history, because I mean, I'm assuming that, as you said, there are multiple sources. So is it that you know what is the truth, or is it that this is what you believe happened? Like, where does it lie?
So it's multiple readings of the past. I don't think any historian can categorically say that they have found the truth. We
Right.
come up with, based on the available evidence, we read that evidence and we understand the most scientific and the most likely method to read it, and we come to certain conclusions. Now, for example, on ancient Indian history, the Harappa civilization, etc. Now we have genetic evidence, etc. There's new technology that's unearthing new evidence. That's naturally going to impact how people read that. In the past, they didn't have genetics. They didn't have that kind of evidence. So their readings were based largely on archaeology and other material sources that were available. We didn't have skeletons that were giving us DNA 100 years ago. So accordingly, conclusions also change. The difference is that you're trained to sort of apply certain methods, apply certain rigorous techniques to come to that conclusion. The difference isn't some people don't bother with the method. They will take something, read it as they like, and say, this is what happened. Look at this record. This says such and such a thing happened, and therefore it must be true. Whereas, a qualified historian or somebody who's trained knows how to approach any text or any written source. For example, you ask, why is it written in Sanskrit and not Tamil? Why is it written by this particular person? Who is their intended audience? All of these, once you interrogate your sources, you get a much clearer idea, and then you connect your dots. So it's a process always. It's never you can never categorically say that you have found the truth. It's always based on the evidence. You're trying to sharpen your tools as much as possible and reach a certain conclusion, and you give why you've reached that conclusion, which is why history is always about debate. On social media, especially the ultra right wing, they have this increasing thing that, oh, we've been sold the wrong history, and this is biased history, and we're puncturing holes in it and things like that. History has always been a bit about debate. It's just that it's never been the debate on social media because it's a very complicated subject. So in a 180 character tweet, you can't really always communicate all the subtleties and nuances. But that's how the world is now. People are on social media, so you have to make an effort to also communicate. And yeah, it's a strange space at the moment because of this constant sort of talk and politicization around it.
Yeah, I mean, that's, 280 characters is pretty impossible. Okay, I've been told by a lot of people to please like the stream and subscribe and all that nonsense. Just like the stream, guys, and yay. Okay, let's
create a YouTube account and then.
Manu, do your books have like an adult rating? Because I've heard a lot of podcasts from Manu, and like it takes him 30 seconds to, in a calm voice, talk about dismembered bodies and like headless men and like spikes and skulls. Like,
no, see, the thing is, we often think that I don't know, violence is an aberration, whereas in reality, violence was a constant. About 150 years ago, and all the way back throughout Indian history. So, even 150 years ago, the British were blowing, rebels out from cannons and tying them up and then sort of blasting them into pieces because they thought, firstly, it was the most merciful way to kill them because the person died so quickly they didn't realize what was happening to them. But it was also the most effective method to kill somebody because imagine chunks of flesh flying over your head across the countryside. It's really like scary. Nobody is going to stand up to British power if that's the kind of message they keep sending, chunks of flesh landing in your village. So, it was considered a very potent means of doing that. And the British always claimed they were here to civilize barbaric Indians. They were here to sort of give us, culture and like upgrade us into like a proper society and all of that. But this is what even they were doing because violence was an everyday part of human existence till about 150 years ago. So, any ruler you take even caste-related violence, it's always existed. It's always been a question of, who's doing violence against whom. What's happened is that in the modern world, one of the gains of democracy is that we now fight with our tongues and our keyboards and our fingers. We don't necessarily fight with swords. That's, democracy has basically tamed human beings into giving up power and seizing power with a minimal amount of violence. Whereas in earlier times, it was a maximum amount of violence. Like this was constantly happening. In Vijayanagar, for example, and kings had to be able to demonstrate that they were capable of violence. Kings couldn't sit on their thrones piously, listening to Sangeet and patronizing poetry. If somebody challenged them, they had to strike out in a violent way. Because if you didn't, you would look weak, which meant that somebody else would come and bump you off the throne. So in Vijayanagar, there was this one king, Devaraya II, and one of his cousins or an uncle, it's a close relative, we don't know the exact relationship, and he basically tries to bump off this ruler and claim the throne, and there's this whole assassination plot, etc. And the man, in one version, the king is stabbed, but he manages to come to the balcony, raise his hand, and show everybody that he's still alive. So don't transfer your allegiance to the man who's tried to kill me. I'm still alive. Then he fights that man, cuts off his head, and the story goes that he holds that in his hand, gets on a horse, and rides up and down the main street in his capital, so the public can see that not only is the king still in charge, he's actually got rid of the person who challenged him. So this was not at all surprising. It was an everyday thing. in the Arthashastra, you have Chanakya recommending that if someone commits adultery with the king's wife, he must be cooked in a jar. It's a very inventive kind of punishment. It's not hanging or beheading. It's cooked in a jar. It's just a very creative means to get rid of somebody. But it's important. You have to show that you're capable of that kind of brutality, so that nobody lifts the finger against you. It's a and we often think these are violent and crude methods, but I'm sorry, till about 150 years ago, around the world, crudeness was how things happened. Even in Russia, the last Tsar, the way his family and he were killed, all of that shows that brutality wasn't such an unusual thing as we might think it is. But
Yeah,
no,
I mean,
there's no
yeah.
adult rating. I assure you. I mean,
By the way, I love the podcast. I also love the book. And in case you're just joining right now, just want to explain what's happening. Mohak Mangal, who has a channel called Soch on YouTube, a very nice channel. He does a lot of detailed and well thought out stuff, including a lot of videos where I've spoken about this before and I'll speak about it again, where he talks about Arnab Goswami quoting a Rajdeep Sardesai story and tries to understand how that happened. His last video was about, which is a conversation which people have been having for a long time about should Uttar Pradesh be divided into more states. So it's really interesting stuff. And also Manu S. Pillai, who's written about four books on history. How many
3
books?
so far.
3.
4th will be
And
out next year.
and he was kind enough to tell me that, hey, listen, Saurabh, you're an idiot. So why don't you read my book of essays, which is a much easier and quicker read. And I really appreciate that he did that, which is a really nice book called The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. What is it?
Of course.
The Courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin. It's actually really, I'm about 80% through to it. It's really like nice, quick snippets of history, which I'm completely enjoying. So that's just an introduction to our guests for today. By the way, get your questions in, ideally, if you can, on Super Chat, and I will try and ask them in about 10 or 15 minutes. I'll just take a couple of questions before that. Divya Warrior says, Manu's ivory throne is exceptional. Being a Malayali, it's stunning to look back at our history. So that's for you.
Thank you,
Somebody
Divya.
was insulting Mohak and me also.
Please don't read
Mohak,
out the insults. We don't want to do that.
but it's way more fun if
not
we do.
Manu's insult, maybe.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
skip my insults and just give me the
Yeah.
praise, and you guys can, insult
So
each other.
Mohak Pathak says, don't want to call it too early, but he's leagues ahead compared to the other two. So thanks, man.
Oh,
Oh,
yeah, maybe
And
we
see,
should be
blush now.
interviewing Mohak, not me.
See, Mohak, and this is a
Look
guy
at the
who's
number
called
of
Mohak. Yeah.
look at the number of awards behind Manu, and look at the
Yeah.
number of awards
Those are
behind
not
you.
even mine, by the way. They belong to my father. Only one book here is mine. Everything else is, patrimony.
Oh, what is your dad won?
All kinds of things. Yeah, he had all kinds of awards. I'm not even sure what these are.
That looks like a star cine, like a cine star award.
Yeah, I assure you, he was never a cinema person. He probably watched 5 movies in his whole life. These are all teaching-related awards. So I'm assuming, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Okay, so please like the stream, and yeah, just so more people are slowly joining in, so that way. Kevna, ready? Let's take a couple of questions, and then we'll have Mohak ask, because I know Mohak always has lots of interesting questions to us. Survata Dasgupta says, does Pillai have a YouTube channel? You don't, right, at the moment?
No, in fact, somebody from YouTube asked me to, but then the thing is, I didn't know how to. I mean, one can't have all these skills, no? Like I can write, I can do a few podcasts maybe once in a while, but I don't think I have the skill yet to create a YouTube channel. So I'm happy appearing on yours and talking to Mohak rather than attempting this unnecessary thing of creating my own and making a flop.
Okay, Suyash Avasti says it's fun to learn about Southern history from Manu, which is often overlooked in the mainstream. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah, it is, because as everything happens, power determines many things. Now, unfortunately, power in India is lopsided. You mentioned Mohak's YouTube video on the Uttar Pradesh factor, right? When a North Indian state controls that many seats in parliament, to begin with, there is a policy effect, and policy effects have ripples throughout other fields as well. To begin with, geographically, Delhi is the capital, which means there is an excessive amount of resources available in that one city compared to, say, other cities. This means certain kinds of research tend to get greater attention, or certain kinds of scholars who are more invested in that particular part of the country get a greater share of platforms and sort of being able to influence how textbooks are written, how government policy is made, etc. And in general, we are prone to thinking of India as the north and the rest. Like that's generally how things work out. And even when you speak of the north, it's usually the Gangetic belt, not even the Punjab that much. Not even towards the east. It's just usually the Gangetic belt, and then everybody else is a sort of corollary attached to that, which is sad because a lot of our history actually comes from the south. Now you think of the 16th century. The Portuguese were in India before the Mughals. By a good few decades, the Portuguese actually came to India and started that whole colonial process before the first of the Mughals set foot in India. And that's, it's interesting. It gives you a slightly different perspective on that. The other big example is the coming of Islam. People often have this feeling that Islam is when all these warriors came into the Sindh with their swords raised and slaughtering people and looting temples, which did happen. But the first time Islam came to the country was via the Arabian Sea, when they came to South India and set up their mosques. And I mean, in Kerala, the first mosque is supposed to have been established in the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad himself. Again, that gives you a very different perspective when people say Islam is a religion of violence that came from outside. Actually, no. It first came in the south very peacefully through embassies of commerce, not with swords raised and people trying to conquer territory. That never happened. So it gives, I mean, the south gives you a slightly different perspective, and it challenges a lot of tropes we believe as absolutely, sacrosanct or the truth, as we were discussing earlier.
Okay,
And that's so true because
no, sorry,
sorry,
go
no,
ahead. Yeah,
go ahead.
please. No, go ahead, Mohan.
No, as in like I was born and raised in Delhi. Throughout, like the history that we're taught is very, you would say, North Indian biased. And like, some of the work that Manu has done, for example, in a podcast, you were talking about how it was atypical for women in Kerala to be wearing a blouse. It was considered not highly if you're actually wearing. And like these things are like almost mind blowing for me because like you would not associate that with India, which is purely mostly, say, a North Indian image that you would have, and that too, like probably a Brahminical image that you'd have. So, like the fact that authors and people like Manu are coming, like that's just showing us history that at least I was completely unaware about.
One of the reasons this happens is that, today if you ask someone to shut their eyes and picture India, the picture that comes in front of your eyes is the map of India. But, the mistake isn't thinking that this map existed and all the history is about what is within the map. Whereas in earlier periods, that was not the case. Delhi had a lot more cultural exposure to Kabul than it had to Kerala. Kerala had a lot more cultural exposure to Arabia than it had with Delhi. These borders as we know them today did not exist. So often one of the reasons these lopsided views have to take place is because we sort of presume these boundaries existed and we have to reconcile everything within these boundaries. Whereas earlier these boundaries didn't exist. The Northeast, forget even the Northeast, Leh Ladakh is part of that Himalayan belt. That Tibet, Bhutan and Sikkim, they were part of one particular cultural zone. People used to, the royal families used to intermarry. One of the Dalai Lamas was born in what is now Arunachal Pradesh. That used to be its own cultural zone for the longest time. The southern parts of the Northeast had a lot of cultural exchanges with what is today Burma. And in fact, at one point when the British were creating or carving out Burma, they came close to sort of giving up a lot of northeastern Indian territory to that administrative segment that rather than us. If they had done that, that would not have been part of our map. But so there's a lot of this as accidents of history that happened because of bureaucratic decisions or whatever. Just as in Africa you'll see these geometrical lines shaping nations and nation states, the Indian map was also to a great extent a legacy given by the colonial regime, and we should not fall into the trap of making our history retrofit these bounds as we know them. So even South India, why is it that one of the greatest temple complexes in the world is not even in India, but it's in Cambodia? Because it sort of challenges the idea of the map as we see it. At one point that cultural exposure existed throughout Southeast Asia, and that was also part of this sort of civilizational zone or whatever you want to call it. Today those are separate nation states, so we don't consider that a part of Hindu history or Indian history or whatever, but it was. And the way these dynamics were shaped and how things moved, all of this was not necessarily restricted to the boundaries that we see today.
Okay, I just want to take a couple of super chats which have come in. Little Sushi says, just got up and saw the notification. A great start to the day. Happy to see Mohak. Good morning with a sun emoji. So that's a good thing. Thanks, Little Sushi. Appreciate it. Indraleen Gokhale asks a question which I'm assuming you've answered before, but I'm sure it comes up quite a lot. Question for Manu: why is our quote unquote taught history so obvious leftist? I remember growing up learning more about Mughals and Sultans than Vijayanagar, Maratha, Maurya, home empires.
I mean, I wouldn't actually say the Marathas are not studied that much because the Marathas do
Yeah.
command a lot of interest, and partly because the Marathas were the ones who eventually smashed the Mughal Empire. So if you're talking about the Mughals, it's difficult to avoid the Marathas. But even within that, often you find that the attention is chiefly in the Chhatrapati phase, which is Shivaji's phase, and not really in what happens after Shivaji. Like the Peshwa phase does not get that much attention. The post, till 1818 when the Marathas finally fall, not really, not that much interest is generated in that. But one of the reasons the Mughals get a lot of attention is partly because the material is much richer than you have, say, on the Vijayanagar Empire. Vijayanagar collapsed in the 17th century. The Mughals collapsed in the mid 19th century. So our sources are much more dense when you talk about the Mughals, as opposed to Vijayanagar, where a lot depends on travelers' accounts. A lot of their own literature does not survive. A lot is, even texts like the Telugu Rayavachakamu, which claims to be about Krishnadevaraya's life, etc., is actually written a good 70, 80 years after his lifetime, and several decades after Vijayanagar lost and the capital was destroyed in 1565 at the Battle of Talikota. So essentially what you have is also a play of material. Historians can, the more material you have, historians tend to focus on that because there's a lot more to sort of digest and deconstruct and understand there. Whereas the further back you go in time, the more slender the material becomes, and therefore the more difficult in trying to make any categorical remarks on the basis of that. That said, yeah, I mean, I suppose there is truth to the fact that there was a sort of leftist orientation for the longest time in academia in India, especially with history. A lot of that is being challenged now, except that it's not being challenged very well. I mean, one of the reasons, I can understand, say, a right-wing angst that there isn't enough non-leftist history written or whatever, but the thing is, there aren't solid histories that have come out of that particular political quarter either. There are certain methods, there's certain rigor, it has to stand up to certain standards. That somehow is not yet seen. You still don't have quality work that's come out from there because, as I said, history is all about debate and engagement. But engagement also needs basic standards and grounds have to be met. You can't, misread things and come up with all kinds of random things. It has to be done in a scientific, systematic way, and then people will talk. But I think now there are people attempting a sort of balanced narrative, coming somewhere towards the center rather than leaning left. And I think the future, given the kind of interest people have in history, any biases or tilts that may exist will correct themselves on their own in the coming years and decades.
I have a question for Mohak. Mohak, you do a lot of YouTube videos which are like issue based and talking about things that are relevant. How much does talking about like things in the present, how much of it is sort of influenced or dictated by reading more of history?
Didn't quite understand. So do you mean like, no, yeah, go ahead.
Like in the sense that, you know what, each time, as Manu said, right, where we've assumed that violence is a sort of new thing where it's not existed throughout history.
Yeah.
And the more I read about history, the more I'm like, a lot of events that occur right now have occurred before in some form. It's just that it's different now. And that sort of shaped me to sort of stop being so I don't know, cocksure about what I'm saying. You know what I'm saying? Does that make any sense? I don't know. I'm just curious how reading about history has sort of influenced your take on current, how things are currently or whatever else it is.
I mean, it definitely it shapes my thinking, and that probably reflects in somehow the narrative that I choose to go with in the videos. For example, say if I were to make a video on just like say women empowerment, the fact that say Manu has done so much work about in Kerala, like divorce was not a social taboo, and women weren't like there was a recent Twitter like a controversy on this woman who was like shooting a girl in a gym in a park, and she was wearing like quote unquote skimpy clothes. And then you talk about Manu's arguments about how not wearing a blouse was the thing to do. So it influences my thinking, and I'm sure I will use these arguments if I were to make a video on women empowerment in India. Because what I've also realized is that the best thing to convince other people is actually to show them evidence of how we have done this in the past. So if I use those examples that Manu has spoken about and other people have spoken about, like that is the best form of convincing them rather than saying, hey, for women empowerment, allowing women to wear whatever they want is the thing to do. But to look at the fact in the history that actually we have done that, and like the world used to be very different back then, and why can't we just learn from what we did 200, 300 years ago?
I mean,
So
I
it
think we just need
influences,
to calm
yeah.
down. Like, there's so much of this like angst and so much like insecurity. Frankly, all this anger is just so sad because it all stems from insecurity. It all stems from cultural insecurity. People just need to calm down. It's just so everything in our history challenges a lot of these things we take for granted today. And instead of really being in awe of that, instead of being understanding how amazing that is, we think somehow that this is either bad history, this is not the history we should be talking about, these are not the things we should be highlighting, and that's just not how it is. It's just sad that we have that kind of cultural insecurity to go around policing people like this, in the name of some imagined pristine culture.
And it's almost about the definition, right? Like, so you keep hearing, oh, this is against our culture, or ye hamari sanskriti ke khilaf hai. But like that definition is a very recent definition, which I didn't know. Like when you read other historians' work, and like what Indian culture was very different from what we perceive it to be right now. In whether that's matrimony or homosexuality, like everything was quite different. And it's just this, yeah, perception that obviously Manu has a lot more to add to that we have just built in our heads.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned, the whole idea of divorce, right? Now, one of the reasons, even recently I was doing some reading, and, you find this in Maharashtra, where as castes tried to sort of move up the caste hierarchy, so, if they were considered Shudras, they wanted to claim Kshatriya status. One of the ways of doing that was firstly wrapping up their women and saying, Parda must be followed. The other was stopping remarriage of widows. Earlier, a lot of communities used to, when we talk about widow remarriage being some great reform in India, it was primarily the Brahmin community and a few associated super elite communities. Practically everybody else allowed their widows to remarry. It was not at all an unusual thing. But when castes wanted to move up the caste hierarchy, what do? You imitate the Brahminical sort of culture. In that situation, you find the Marathas, for example, aristocratic Marathas start preventing their women from remarrying or going out and being seen in public and things like that, because these are all means to sort of move up the caste hierarchy. It wasn't as though it was at all an unusual thing, not just in Kerala, but lots of other parts of India. We think that somehow our ancestors were some pre-fit this sort of idea that, oh, widow remarriage is bad, they have to be sati savitris and so on, but not really. There's very little evidence to suggest that was the case.
Okay, there's a couple of I'll keep reading some super chats and stuff for that. By the way, Abhinash has become a member, so welcome to level 2, Abhinash. It sounds so cool when it says welcome to level 2, like this is a gaming thing. It's like welcome to level 2. Now you must beat Togiyashi or whatever that guy was. So yeah, membership is open. You can do that. Okay, I lots of questions coming in. First of all, thanks to Neeraj Krishnan, always a nice person. Thank you so much to Neeraj for his super chat. You always very kind. Michael Chaudhary has put out a nice sarcastic super chat, which is hello to all anti-nationals. We don't need news on jobs, but on Kangana, and with that emoji like that. So that's fun. Okay, let's take a couple more questions. Govinda Keshav Das asks, what is your opinion of Tipu Sultan and the whitewashing of his fanatical Islamist mindset? And why is it never talked about? Is it a trope too?
Actually, so many people talk about it so
Yeah.
hysterically also these days. I find it slightly amusing when people say nobody talks about it, because it's all people talk about on social media these days. No, the thing is, and I keep stressing this wherever I can, it's not an either or situation. It is not that Tipu was either some super syncretic, a celebrator of pluralism, or he was some kind of villainous fanatic. A king could be both of these things. That is why context matters a lot. Which is to say, what if in this debate, what happens? Some people say, oh, look, he gave grants to temples, he supported the Shankaracharya here, his minister was a Brahmin, Purnaya, for example, etc., etc. Other people will say, no, he conquered Malabar, converted people by force, smashed temples, things like that. Also true. But as I said, it's not an either or. You have to look at where he's doing these things. Tipu Sultan, in his settled territories, where he's actually already in control, has absolutely no qualms supporting temples, giving Brahmins grants, employing Brahmins as ministers, or any of that. But when he conquers a territory, which is what happened in Malabar, he proved to be extremely brutal. Now, that is where you find people are being, temples are being smashed, and not just any temple. It's usually temples connected with prominent families, prominent ruling houses. Those are the ones that he'll go after, not just like random temples on the way that the army is passing. It has to be a temple that means something in terms of local politics. So there's a story in Kerala that he entered Malabar, and he said that he would conquer even Travancore, which is South Kerala, and tie his horse to the flagstaff of the Padmanabha Swami temple. Now, the Padmanabha Swami temple was the dynastic temple of the Maharajas of Travancore. So that statement had something to do with politics also, rather than just smashing temples for its own sake. Now, for example, there's this family who are descendants of the 14th, 15th century, a mathematician called Sangramagama Madhava. In their family temple, you'll see two Dwarapalakas, both of whom are missing their arms. Because they say when Tipu's army was passing, this prominent Brahmin family, who were big landlords there, they did not bend the knee. They disappeared from there. So his soldiers quickly went into the temple, chopped off the hands of the Dwarapalakas, and went. It was a statement saying, "You've not bent the knee, therefore, we are going to come into your temple." However, there was another family. This I got from Jaya Jetli, the ex-politician who's a descendant of the Kolangod Rajas, also in that Palakkad area of Kerala. There, on the contrary, Tipu Sultan actually gave a pedestal or something for the deity to be placed on, because that family did bend the knee to Tipu Sultan. So even in a conquest territory, depending on how the local prominent people behaved, the king's attitude could also change. So again, it's not an either or. When he's conquering territories, he has every incentive to be brutal. And of course, religious vocabulary is really heightened during times of war. You find this even with the Mughal Emperor Babur, for example. Babur at one time, before he comes to India, is in really dire straits. He needs help from the Persians, the Shah of Iran. Immediately, he sort of gives up his Sunni faith, pretends to be a Shia, gets the Shah of Iran's help, and then goes back to being a Sunni. Then he comes into India. In his writings, you find that he doesn't really say much about the infidels or the idol worshippers or any of that. However, there's this one moment when the Rana has sort of created this coalition, and they're coming to get Babur, and there's this historic battle about to happen. Babur's best generals have gone back to Afghanistan. His camp is really demoralized. At this time, for the first time, Babur builds up this jihadist language and says this is a battle against the infidels. So basically, when he's cornered, when he really has a moral problem, when his best talent, military talent, is away, he sort of builds up a jihadist language to fight it. Otherwise, the same Babur who's doing jihadi language in India had no issue switching between Sunni Islam and Shia Islam when it suited his purposes in another context. So a lot of religious vocabulary is used in times of warfare. In times, temple building is often done when kings are seeking legitimacy or there are new powers emerging in a certain area. It includes even within the Hindu fold, there are cases like this. So, for example, the Vijayanagar Emperor Krishnadevaraya, one of his ways of penetrating a lots of territories in Tamil Nadu and places where Vijayanagar was not naturally strong, which was not their heartland, was to send in Madhava Brahmins. He used to favor that particular set of Brahmins over other Brahmins because they sort of penetrated these regions, set up institutions. He gave them land grants and basically sort of, pushed the king's agenda in that sense. And he would make them trustees in temples where they would then fight with the early Brahmins who were there from previous dynasties, patronage and things like that. So it doesn't mean religion did not exist. It does not mean that kings were not capable of using religious vocabulary or jihadist language or any of that. Kings were very capable of it. Even a Chhatrapati Shivaji, for example, did talk of a Hindavi Swaraj. He did talk of getting rid of Yavana languages and resurrecting Sanskrit as a sort of language of diplomacy instead of Persian. He did have such ideas. But again, it's linked to lots of other things. At one point, he was almost sort of co-opted into the Mughal order. That failed. The moment it failed, he realized now there's no going back to this particular option. So he consecrates himself as a king and uses that kingly vocabulary or that Sanskritic vocabulary to carve out his own identity. So kings often use religious vocabulary to sort of cement their own identity. It does not mean that you can't read it as communal identities as we see it today. Communalism today is that, oh my God, majority community is Hindu, minority community is Muslim. Kings in those days did not have censuses. They did not have these feelings that, oh, this is a majority and that is a minority. For a Dalit caste that has no access to a temple, the Brahmin is as alien as a Muslim. They don't feel like they're part of one community. Different castes, enjoyed different positions and they were treated differently. Kings, however, did have an incentive in using religious language for political purposes. I mentioned the case of the Padmanabha Swami temple. In the 18th century, when Travancore was created, it was created by this warrior who ruled over a political backwater in Kerala. Nobody cared about that place. It was not even a major player. He gets hold of East India Company arms. He gets hold of mercenaries from Tamil Nadu, conquers almost half of Kerala. But everywhere he goes, he's considered an outsider. He's considered a conqueror. So at one time, his soldiers go to reap the harvest of a temple. The priests hit them with brooms and throw them out, saying that you guys are outsiders here. But then what does he do? He realizes that he has to somehow legitimize himself. The first thing he does is he goes and surrenders, in quotes, all his conquests to the Padmanabha Swami temple, saying hereafter God is the king of this land. I am just God's regent of servant ruling in his name. So till yesterday, you could criticize the king, saying that, oh, this king is a usurper, this king is a conqueror, he's an outsider. But now he's made it about God. God is the owner. You can't criticize God. It's a little bit like today's national, anti-national. You criticize the government or you criticize the powers that be, you're considered anti-national, even though there's a difference between nation and government. It's a very effective tool in terms of constructing a new narrative. He creates this new narrative. The other thing he does is he uses highly Sanskritic rituals to elevate his caste position. So there's this ceremony called Hiranyagarbha where the king goes and sits. He's basically considered Shudra. So he goes and sits inside a golden cow. The Brahmins pelt the cow with gomutra and flowers and chant mantras of birth. And then the king jumps out from under the tail of this golden cow. And now he's considered this reborn into the Kshatriya caste and descendant of the moon or Soma Vamsha or whatever you want to call it. And he manages to gain a caste upgrade as well. He organizes huge festivals. There's every 6 years, there's a festival where thousands of Brahmins come and chant the Vedas. They're all given great dakshinas. They're fed for a good 30, 40 days. These festivals, all of these are reinforcing the idea of the state itself. They're not really purely about religion. They're also about cementing the king's authority. We should not fall into the trap of thinking just as politicians today use religion for political gains rather than purely out of some spiritual reasons. So too in the past, kings were able to use religion when it suited them politically, and when it did not suit them, they were perfectly capable of putting that aside and doing what they liked. So selective use of religion has always existed because religion has always been an appealing thing. The only caution I would sort of recommend is that we should not think when we speak about religious conflicts in the past that these were communal conflicts. These were not masses of people saying, oh my God, I'm a Hindu, you are a Muslim, let us fight. These are kings who have different visions of their societies, kings who have defined themselves using different religious vocabularies, and they are the ones clashing. That is why you'll find often in a Muslim king, there'll be Hindu soldiers only fighting another Hindu king. In the Hindu king side, you'll find Muslim soldiers fighting a Muslim king, because the soldiers really don't matter. Communities are not really the factor that are involved. It is the king's image that he uses religion to burnish and sort of embellish.
Interesting. Okay, lots of super chats coming in. And again, I just want to say that keep liking and all that stuff. More and more people are joining in. Thanks a lot to everybody here. Mohak, let's take a couple of questions from you.
Oh, sorry. So I had a question. So Manu, the most common question that you get is, oh, you've published 3 books before 30, and how did you do it, and all of that. So I had a different, a flip side to that. Because I've been watching a lot of these chess streams that Samay does, and there's this Indian play with it, and a lot of these young talents, their childhood is very different from what you call the normal childhood. Say my childhood, which is very uneventful, right? Which is barely productive.
How modest.
Whereas say your you said somewhere that wherever your research had, your decisions were based on where the archival records were. So if your resources were in London, you moved to London. So how different was, say, your childhood as compared to people around you, your cousins or your friends, and do you have that thing? Oh, what if I had a different childhood? Because you were embedded in books, I'm guessing, right? Which is what allowed you to publish these books so young. So how was it different, and how has it shaped you?
I don't know if it was all that different, because I did, all the usual kiddie things and all of that. I didn't even read very much till I was about 12 years old. At one point, my sister basically, to get me to shut up, thrust a book in my hand, and then I started sort of picked up the habit of reading. So I don't know if one can say that there was something different about the childhood. I think a lot may depend on parents, really, Because one thing I can say is that there was never any pressure as to, oh my God, this is what you have to be in life, or this is what you have to go out and, this is the occupation that is prescribed for you. There was no pressure like that. My parents, not because, they were, I don't know, some kind of like radical people in terms of how to raise their children, just by personality. My father was firstly super busy. And my mother also had her own sort of things. And my sister and I often joke that we sort of grew up like fungus on the wall, because my parents were like, look, we are feeding you, we are nourishing you, we're taking care of you, but, evolve your own minds. Like, there was no trying to engineer anything in our heads as to whether we should be engineers or whether we should become doctors or whatever. So both of us were like free in that sense to fiddle around with things that interested us. And in my case, as I started reading more and more, I got very interested in history. I got very interested in stories from history. It wasn't history just in the sense of, oh my God, I want to uncover the past because it's so, interesting about what happened in the past. But it's also the way you approach the past, the way you tell the stories of the past. And part of that was, again, family influence. My grandmother was, and I've said this in many interviews, so it may be repetitive for some people, but she was this extremely vivid storyteller, completely uncensored about things. None of this grandmotherly business about giving us stories from the epics with wonderful moral values and lessons at the end of it. On the contrary, she gave me lots of, uncensored, irreverent details about our own ancestors, about my own great uncles and great grandmothers and people like that. And I found that fascinating because it was such a different world from my history books, for example. A great grandmother who sort of tames an elephant, a great uncle who's littered the ancestral village with illegitimate children. And to hear somebody talk about these, you think of grandparents, great grandparents as concepts. You don't really think of them as people. In their time, they were people made of flesh and blood. In their time, they had their own desires, they had their own weaknesses, they had their own greed, they had their own like human behavior and conduct. We're not taught to think about our parents and grandparents as human beings. We see them as somehow put on these minor pedestals as institutions rather than individuals. But if you just change that gaze and look at them as individuals, I find it fascinating. I found it fascinating, for example, that in 1962, my grandmother gave birth to my mother and then told my grandfather that, I'm sorry, this business of giving birth to children is extremely painful. I don't want children again. And my grandfather was like, fine, your body, your choice. And it was 7 years later that he proposed to my grandmother and said, look, she's growing up alone. Maybe a sibling is not a bad idea. And my grandmother's like, well, he asked so sweetly that I couldn't say no. And I find that very interesting. I find these human dynamics really fascinating, that this is not grandparents for me. It is a husband and a wife basically negotiating their life together. There are ups, there are downs, and it's always interesting to look at human beings in their own sort of world rather than applying our filter as grandmother, grandfather. And that you take it back to history and you start realizing, oh my God, these historical characters were such cartoons, so many of them, they were so rich and vivid and imaginative. And that's how I started sort of constructing my interest in history. But the other thing, I suppose, is precisely because my parents basically let us do what we wanted, they also told us that, if we fall down or if we take any risks, we have to live with the cost of it. So there was no question of sort of, making a decision and then regretting it. So if I had made a decision, I really had to work super hard. And that was very obvious to me from the age of about 19, because when I told them that I wanted to go to London to do my master's, it was secretly because I wanted to get to the archives in London. And you can't convince your parents to spend a bomb at 19 to say that you want to write a book. So I said, oh, master's degree, yum, how great. And they said, okay, fine, do what you want. But having got there, I mean, it sounds a little immodest, but I practically lived in the archives. I would rush from my classes and spend the rest of the day in the archives because I knew I only had that one chance. I couldn't squander it. I didn't have a social life. I must have made 3 friends there because I was practically working all that time. And sometimes I regret that I spent my first half of the 20s entirely immersed in work and didn't do any of the foolish things that we are allowed to do in our early 20s. But all the same, in the larger scheme of things, no regret as such. It's worked out well, and I enjoy what I do. And it sometimes makes you a little too grown up for your age, and which is not necessarily a very useful thing. If you sometimes sound like a grandpa when you're already just about 30, but we all make our choices, and we must live with it.
You're a true historian, by the way, because what I love about any conversation with you is that the answer is always a well thought out and well composed essay. It's like you've contemplated this before, and this is like I can imagine you thinking like this is going to be in the next next book. Okay, there's a lot of again questions coming. People are quite excited about questions. Bhavneet Bhinder says, as Manu said, show what brutality one is capable of and no one will dare stand up. It's a petrifying thought. Dare one say perhaps feels contemporary.
Yeah.
Okay. Any comments on that or should we just move?
I mean, yeah, I mean, even now, what you often see, in terms of these lynch mobs and things like that, these are not merely accidents of what are happening now. These are sort of signals as well. When the state refuses to clamp down, it is a signal. The event itself may have just happened somewhere in the wilderness and it may have happened for various reasons. But when the authorities refuse to stamp down on it, that is where the signal lies, which basically means that occasionally this kind of bloodletting is a kind of signal that is being given out to a larger society. And that is really a strategic use, I think, of violence that exists even today. And it's sad. It's just sad that we still have to do something like that in the 21st century. But yeah, I suppose there is a contemporary quality to demonstrations of violence, because demonstrations of violence are always intended to communicate something. They're not happening just for the sake of violence. They're trying to tell you something and they're trying to issue a certain warning, perhaps.
I mean, the defense I'm assuming of that would be that, and again, I'm not defending any of it. I'm just saying that a lot of the defense they say is because India is such a massive country with so many law and order issues that they often think that in whichever direction the violence lies, it's they find it hard to clamp down on it, and that's the defense.
Yeah, I mean I understand the idea. This is a large country. At some point or the other, different corner, something or the other is burning. Somewhere or the other in this humongous country. But the difference is, we had that case a couple of years ago, right, where the union minister goes and garlands a set of people on stage who were accused and by the dying man himself, accused of lynching him, and their names are actually in the man's dying statement. And a minister goes and garlands, and that kind of thing is egregious. You can get away with saying that this kind of thing happens. It's a big country. We're sorry. Not everything can be controlled. The police is spread out thin. Understand all that. That's all fine. There's this book by Milan Vaishnav called When Crime Pays, and it talks about how from the 1950s, from the time we were independent practically, crime was a natural corollary to Indian politics, and therefore things in India became increasingly criminalized over the decades. It became two sides of the same coin. Politics on one hand, institutions talk of democracy. On the ground, they use the criminals and gundas and things like that. So I'm not saying that these things don't happen in India, but when you have this egregious situation where a sitting minister in a national government goes out and garlands people who've been accused in a very, very serious violent crime, I think it's difficult to defend that kind of thing, because that just crosses many lines that are there. You can't then say that it was merely an accident or it was a mistake. Those things are not. I wouldn't believe that those are mistakes or just happen to be what they are.
I mean, talking about something less, a crime that was like almost hilarious. I don't know if you guys saw this video of this Instagram, which I talked about yesterday also. In UP, these guys enter a jewelry store.
Oh yeah,
they sanitize their hands and they take a gun. I saw this video. I'm like, this is scary and this is hilarious at the same time. Like, I feel bad for the guy who got robbed, but at least they're sanitizing their hands.
Yeah,
that's like Anurag Kashyap's third Gangs of Wasseypur script is like right there.
Yeah, these criminals who are germaphobes. Okay. Mohak, let's take a question from you, yeah? Or I can take
I have an interesting question. Manu, what does a chief of staff of Shashi Tharoor do?
So, there's an interesting story to this. Firstly, I first joined him in 2011 out of the blue. I'd come back from London and I needed to be in Delhi to work at the National Archives. So I was like, I have a degree in economics and international relations. Shashi Tharoor exists. He's got experience in foreign policy, etc. Let me, apply for an internship. So I sent him a random email. There was an email available on his website of a private secretary who had already left by then. Luckily, that man forwarded it to him. He liked my email more than my CV, because at 21, your CV really doesn't have much. And, all you have is 2 degrees and that's it. But he liked the way I had written the email. So he said, why don't you come meet me? And I happened to be going to Kerala at that time. And I still remember getting off. He was at this public function and I remember coming down the steps and I was going up and he said, you must be Manu. Go up. There's a sadhya, which is this Kerala feast happening. Eat and then we'll talk. So I went up, sat with a bunch of ladies and children, had a nice sadhya, and then squashed into his car before he went for his next engagement. We talked and he gave me an internship. And that's how I landed up in Delhi. Then what happened is, luckily for me, about a month later, the existing private secretary at that time left, and I got bumped up into that position. And that's how I originally started. So it was me and a gentleman who was handling the clerical stuff. So I was doing everything from parliamentary questions, research, speech writing, helping with speeches, things like that. All of that was happening simultaneously. There was no fixed definition to that role. But then after I left, I then went back to London, worked at the House of Lords, did my BBC gig, came back. My successor, one of my successors, she decided to invent this title of Chief of Staff, because over time what happened, we had also expanded the office. More interns came in, different sort of segregation of work took place. The team got bigger. And the frank truth is that she was, I think, applying for a university in America, and she needed to show progression in her career. And she'll hate me for saying this. So she invented the title of Chief of Staff. And then what happened is, when she left, I had reason to be in Delhi again. And he said, look, why don't you just come in and take over your old job? And I said, fine. And I inherited the title as well. And it made sense then. I didn't give up the title because I could also see why my ex-colleague did it, which is that he was also chairperson of the Foreign Affairs Committee in Parliament. So for that position, it sort of made sense to have a title like Chief of Staff. It's a slightly Americanized thing Indian system, beholden to the British tradition rather than the American. But we stuck to it, and it sounds very fancy, but it was basically a lot of jobs combined into one, and chasing a lot of people to do their jobs, and all of that. But it was not my creation. I inherited it. I'm guilty to the fact of not giving it up and holding on to it as though it was a thing to wear very proudly.
It works nicely though, man. It's like, Chief of Staff sounds way more impressive than anything else.
Frankly, it may sound impressive to you. If you call up a Sarkari office in Parliament or whatever and tell them that you're a Chief of Staff, they'll say, hey, what on earth is this? Unheard of concept. It's usually PS, PA, those are the titles they use in Sarkari offices.
Yeah, PSPA doesn't have that much of. I mean, even though the job must be the same, but it doesn't have the same kind of resonance.
No, so the difference is also Shashi Tharoor has a habit of attracting a lot of young people around him. So a lot of people who are very young end up working in his office. It's not, if you look at the demographics of the office, it's people in their 20s always. And I sort of set the trend, but after that we've always hired people who are fresh graduates who've just come out and are smart, not necessarily in an academic sense. The result of that is that people are interested in titles that are slightly different from PAPS, because it doesn't, to a young generation, it doesn't really appeal when you call them things like that. So
I've always thought about, I think when we initially started East India Comedy, I think we had tried to create these fake titles for ourselves to make it sound really grandiose, and it didn't really pan out very nicely because we used to be at meetings and people would be like, "Lordling of creativity." What the fuck does that mean? Like, get out of my office.
No, we used to get some get out situations when, if ever, for example, in my first stint, I had to go to Parliament or go to a Sarkari office. So when you speak on the phone, people think you're some retired IAS officer or whatever. You sound very serious. And then you land up there and they're like, "Ye to bacha hai," and then they lose all respect because they're like, "Why did I show so much regard to this boy? He's only 21, 22," and that always, stung.
Questions coming from Tushant Jha, who asked, why do people consider not covering Maratha, Vijayanagar as leftists, while the same books also don't cover Bijapur or Bahmanis, etc.?
Hey, not fair, considering that I wrote this other book called Rebel Sultans, which is about Vijayanagar and the Deccan Sultanates. But it's the same thing, right? Like we're so obsessed with Mughal history, and with good reason, as I discussed earlier, that we tend to forget that there were other parts of the country where equally fascinating dynamics were taking place. Now, you find, for example, in Vijayanagar, one of these emperors, when the Portuguese first come to his court, he actually proposes a matrimonial alliance with the Portuguese royal family. So he says, you send me a daughter, I'll send you a daughter from here. You send me a Portuguese princess, and I will rule the South Indian peninsula. You will rule the seas. And it was just, a fascinating thing to think of a Vijayanagar emperor in that period, in the 1600s, early 1600s, talking about, early 1500s, talking about a matrimonial alliance between a Catholic royal family far away in Europe that he's not even seen, and his own family here. So too, you find a situation where there's this Bijapur prince who is sort of pushed out of the succession. He goes into Goa, and the Portuguese say, we'll help you claim the throne or whatever. And the poor man has a daughter. She decides to convert to Christianity. And there's this hilarious scene where the governor and the entire Portuguese establishment land up to take this girl away and convert her. And the father, the mother and the women in the household are pulling her from one side. The Christians are pulling her from the other side, and they're trying to take her away and convert her. And she actually converts. So one branch of the Bijapur royal family ends up becoming Christians in Portuguese ruled Goa, and they are descended as Catholics from there. And the Bijapur royal family, to begin with, is a union of a man with Shia sympathies who's come from Persia and a Maratha woman. So from day one, it's a mix of Maratha blood and Persian blood. And then as the generations pass, you find all kinds of new elements coming into it. You find the Nizam Shahs of Ahmednagar, Shia Muslims, if you think technically speaking, they send their bodies to be buried in Karbala in Iraq, which is a holy site for the Shias. But they're actually descended from a converted Brahmin. And they used to even take begums who were black. They used to have these African begums as well. And it's remarkable to think of a line of Maratha, of Brahmin descent, sending their bodies to be buried in Karbala in Iraq with black begums in a city like Ahmednagar, which is today a tier 2 town in India. It's just remarkable to think of black queens in India in the 17th century. But these things existed. So they deserve a certain kind of attention. The other thing is also the kind of sources we use, right? For example, one of the grievances a historian like Sanjay Subramaniam, for example, often raises is that we are very dependent on the British colonial sources. We don't necessarily look at the Dutch and the Portuguese, partly because we don't have proficiency in those languages. But they also hold a lot of material that is exceedingly fascinating and hugely interesting. So, a lot of this is partly also because of how much material we've uncovered, what languages those materials are, and how much material is available, all of that.
Okay, we'll take one more super chat. Actually, this is for both of you, which is coming from LR, who says, Manu Mohak, anything about Kumari Kandam, please?
I don't know about Kumari
Even I'm not
Kandam.
familiar with that.
Yeah. So that's the other thing. Historians have specific, periods they work on. So, for example, if you ask me about Harappa, I'll have a few general things to say, but I'm no expert on that period. I usually work on the early modern and colonial period, primarily colonial. So anything, beyond that, one can't really say or give you a very confident answer.
Mohak, do you know what they're asking? No, so no. Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, little sushi. Okay, there's just a lot of questions coming. I just want to tell you that I can't probably ask all of them because it's just a ton of them. But thank you so much for your questions. In case you just enjoy this podcast, you can just become a member or support on Insta, Mojo, and PayPal. In case your questions, because I think I have a pending list of about 13 questions, I'll try and ask as many as possible. But yeah. Okay, little sushi again asks, what we perceive as Indian culture is mostly Victorian. We were under British rule for so long, we can't recognize our own culture. That's yeah. Is that true?
That is true. And, since Mo gave the example of women in Kerala not wearing blouses, this actually comes from that. I mean, the reason people have a hesitation talking about that is partly because of that Victorian gaze. Because, often what you find is till the 1920s, even the 40s, women in Kerala, even upper caste women did not wear blouses. Blouses were considered an external thing. They were not considered Malayali enough. So you actually have photographic evidence of queens and Brahmin women, etc., who are all uniformly topless because toplessness was considered the norm. It was not even a thing to be discussed. But what happens is the Victorians come and they bring a new gaze to the female body. And they say, oh my God, women are walking around topless. Hi, what is this? They should be covered up and this is not moral and this is not appropriate and cultured and so on. And then what happens is a lot of Malayali men who are getting access to English education, which is usually the universities in Madras from English-speaking teachers, etc., they pick up a lot of these ideas and they think, yes, our women have to be made chaste. They have to start wearing blouses. They have to start dressing a certain way. And you have all kinds of comical anecdotal evidence about how this initially pans out. So, for instance, the Maharaja of Travancore, under pressure from the British resident in his court, at one point decrees that all the palace servants must wear blouses. So the women wear blouses in the palace, but the moment they get out of the palace gate, the first thing they do is take off the blouses so none of their friends see them. Another time, there's a story, I'm not sure who exactly this is about. A very old person told me about this in Cochin, about how in Thrissur there was a social reformer who said, I'm going to take out a procession of women wearing blouses. So, all the women will learn by their example. So he takes out a procession of women in blouses. Except that, such a huge crowd comes out to see this idea of women in blouses that the women get very self-conscious. They tear off their blouses and run away because they're embarrassed to be seen in blouses. Shirts, it's not just women, men also originally, when they sat down for a meal, usually in these upper caste families, before you sit down for your afternoon lunch or whatever, you have to go take a dip in the pond to be shuddhi and then, and then come and sit down. wearing a shirt was considered brushed. It was considered ashuddha. You could not wear a shirt and sit down. So one of the first acts of rebellion in the Brahmin community of the Nambudris in Kerala was young men sitting down to lunch in shirts, because shirts were considered defying the older orthodox set of people. A favorite anecdote that I can't stop repeating is Aubrey Menon writing. He was, part Irish. His mother was Irish. His father was a Malayali, and he's written once about how his Irish mother came to meet his father's family, and the mother-in-law, who's this, very stately Naya woman, completely topless, invites her daughter-in-law to come and see her. And the maid comes running back saying, "Oh, she's sitting there covered up." And the mother-in-law says, "Oh, if she's covered up, then she must be preparing for adultery, because no cultured woman will sit there with her breasts covered." So you have a lot of anecdotal stories like that. In my own family, my great-grandmother got her first blouse. It was called a rauka in the 1940s. She's a middle-aged woman. Her daughters got married. The young girls have all started wearing blouses, but for the wedding, the bridegroom's mother gets her a rauka, a blouse. And she wears it, and she's standing in front of the mirror and admiring it. And her daughters say, "Oh, why don't you come out now?" And she says, "Oh, no, I can't come out wearing a blouse. What do my brothers and your father think?" Because she thought a dignified elderly lady like her could not be seen in public wearing a blouse, because everybody would think she was some kind of, a wrong woman or public woman or things like that. And this was the reality of Kerala till about 60, 70 years ago. Today, if you go there and make such suggestions, especially when people talk about, we want to protect our tradition, we want to protect our culture, these are some of our cultural truths that I want to give them, which will give them a heart attack, rather than getting them equally eager to protect this element of our culture. So when people, since Mohak mentioned, when people talk about women in skimpy clothes, I do really think of these old paintings and photographs, including these Ravi Varma paintings of women who are all quite, comfortable being scantily clad, because that was simply how it was. There was, till it's all in our eyes, right? Till we in our heads start thinking something is wrong, it is not necessarily seen as wrong. It is not necessarily an alien thing. And this was across India. Stitched clothing came to India from the Islamic world. It was not an Indian thing, which is why even today when people do pujas, etc., look at the dhoti, look at the sari. These are not stitched. These are, you wrap them around in a certain way, but there's no fabric joined together with stitches. That is why even now for pujas, you take off your shirt, you wear a dhoti, and that's how you sit down for religious things, because you're sticking to the purer original idea of what that clothing was. Tirupati, Krishnadevaraya gave this amazing bronze of himself and his wives are topless in that particular bronze. But today, if you go to Tirumala, you will see that they've wrapped them up in saris, because apparently no longer, even in bronze form, can Krishnadevaraya's wives be seen topless. It tells more about us rather than about our ancestors.
Okay, just a couple
sounds
of
like such an alternate reality, like something that we're so not used to.
So much to do with caste and custom also, right? For example, in 1806, there was this thing called the Vellore Mutiny, which was basically because the British had decided to standardize the turbans and the facial hair of all their soldiers. So you could only twirl your mustache one way, and everybody was given a standard turban. What they didn't realize is that in a casteist society like India, if you're walking on a road, you should be able to tell another person's caste at one glance, which is usually by the way they are dressed. So different castes were allowed different kinds of ornaments, different hairstyles, different kind of facial hair. So when they started tampering and saying all the Sepoys have to start wearing the same mustache, the Sepoys thought they were being converted, because they thought, no, I am a Rajput, so I have to do my mustache this way. Somebody else is a Muslim, therefore he has to grow his beard out a certain way. The Sikh has a different way of dressing himself. So they thought the British were tampering with this, and they actually had a mutiny because they thought that they were being secretly converted. Whereas the British, and there's actually a quote from an inquiry report where they say that the amount of hair on the upper lip of a sepoy is the last thing that would concern an empire, but it did concern an empire because it led to rebellion. So costume in India is just a fascinating subject.
Manu, you're such a great storyteller. Please, start a YouTube channel.
Yeah.
I'll help you set up one.
Yeah, it's pretty easy. You have by the way, your camera is pretty nicely set up already. I think you're good to go. This is it.
Mohak you have a compliments for my background when we, before we went live.
Yeah. You have the ultimate combination of books and awards, and that's all you
need.
not
mine. I stress again, not my awards.
That doesn't matter.
That doesn't matter at all.
Okay. I just we'll take a question from Mohak. Before that, just want to say you guys can just like the stream again. I have been told by Sahil Shah repeatedly that you don't ask this enough, so please like the stream so more people can join in. We have about 1,200 people watching, so that's pretty good. I have a lot more super chats, but okay, wait 1 second. Okay, Mohak, go ahead. If you have a question, please ask. By the way, a lot of people
Yeah.
are demanding that we should do a separate stream with Mohak. LR has said, Saurabh, do a separate stream with Mohak, please. Listen, I'm going to be calling Mohak quite a lot. So, I mean, it's all up to him to say yes or no. So that's, that's entirely, yeah.
Those are
Mohak, please
the
go ahead.
people that I've planted into the chat, by the way, just so that I stay relevant in this.
Yeah.
Manu had a question. So, like, while growing up in history textbooks, like Mahatma Gandhi is this ultimate figure, right? Like this great mass leader, like perfect figure, no flaws. And only recently, like I've come across a lot of people and historians, such as like many historians, talking about how some of his views on, say, women and caste were not as evolved. And I think Amit Verma was talking about how B.R. Ambedkar, according to him, is one of the greatest Indian public intellectuals, whereas Gandhi was a great mass leader, but perhaps not an intellectual. So it's a two-part question. Firstly, like, what are the different, since like there's not much I know, but I know that this exists, but like, what are the different views of Mahatma Gandhi that today we would find very problematic? And second, like, what damage has it done to us that, so we recognize the importance of symbols, and like Gandhi is that symbol for us as a nation. But what damage has it done in some ways to Gandhi's legacy that he is someone who can't be critiqued? Like even today, like say the BJP and its ecosystem, which has many issues with Gandhi, like even they would be scared to just criticize Gandhi. So yeah, so what are the different views that you find problematic, and what damage has it done as a historian, you think?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of serious histories of Gandhi have never actually glossed over on this. It's just that what happens in India is that because he's the father of the nation, there is this natural predisposition to pedestalization. One of the ways to kill any sort of historical figure is to put them on a pedestal and say, "Oh my God, garland dal, they are done. Like now they're demigods. They're no longer human beings." Now, Gandhi had a lot of problematic things in his life, much of which he himself acknowledged. In his early phase, a lot of people in Africa now find a lot of his writing and a lot of his opinions deeply offensive, because when he lived in Africa, some of his remarks about the locals over there, and he tried to sort of say that his chief quest seemed to be to tell the white rulers that the Indians should not be clubbed with the Africans. That is also deeply offensive to Africans. It was not uniform equality for everybody. It was saying that, oh, we are slightly better than them, so we need to be treated better than the Africans. So you have that young Gandhi, but you also find that as he gets older, he acknowledges a lot of his errors with the passage of time. So considering that he's come a full circle, some of that can be let go of, because it's not like he stuck to it, like a Winston Churchill, for example, stuck to his guns no matter what. Whereas with the Gandhi, you find there is a revision of views that often happens. On caste is really where Gandhi becomes even more complicated, because even the invention of the term Harijan for Dalit communities, it's slightly patronizing. I mean, you're saying the children of God, but and you're saying that cleaning toilets, etc. It's all this is all mandated. Caste was not originally a bad thing. At one point in his life, he almost wanted to say that maybe caste degraded into something, but it was not originally a bad thing. It was originally, and you find a lot of arguments like that even today. So a lot of Dalits, for example, find a lot of Gandhi's writings not only patronizing but deeply offensive. The famous pact with Ambedkar was when the British were prepared to give the Dalits a separate electorate, which would essentially have completely cut them off from the so-called majority Hindu community. It would have broken the concept of the majority. And Gandhi went on a fast unto death. And Ambedkar had to capitulate. And Ambedkar, to the end of his life, he regretted having to bow down before Gandhiji's blackmail at that time. And they do often, he did see it as blackmail. He did see it as, he wanted to really uplift his people, and separate electorates would have given them teeth. It would have given them a lot of power in terms of negotiating their own future. Whereas being subsumed in the majority would mean that you're considered Hindus, but you're still considered B-grade Hindus. So, and at that time, for Gandhiji to threaten a fast unto death and put that kind of pressure on Ambedkar was not something Ambedkar ever forgot or forgave. So there is a lot that is, and as Gandhi got older, his own subordinates, starting from Nehru onwards, they found a lot of his ideas impractical in terms of running a government in post-independence India. So, and a lot of things, for example, strategically also, when the Kashmir issue happened, I believe, India still was sitting on a lot of money that was owed to Pakistan. And Gandhiji insisted that the money be paid, whereas Sardar Patel was very keen to hold on to it till the Pakistanis behaved at that time. And a lot of people thought that was, it may have made for very lofty beliefs and so on, but it was not. Now that you're in power, now that you have to protect a nation state that you fought so hard to create, you have to be able to take strategic decisions, which are sometimes morally perhaps questionable. Any ruler has to do that. It's not easy to be a ruler in that sense. And there, Gandhiji's pressure again worked against his own subordinates. So it is a mixed legacy in that sense. It does not take away from the greatness of the fact that in a time when most people were illiterate, in a time when there was no social media, there was no instrument to reach the masses, somehow this man managed to galvanize a large proportion of our society who saw him as very much a saintly figure. And the good, or rather the effective thing about Gandhi is that he did not fall on either extremes. He sort of managed to hold the middle ground and sort of tailor his message in a way that it would appeal to the largest and the most influential segment possible, ranging from businessmen who funded the Congress party. As Sarojini Naidu famously said, to keep Gandhi in poverty, it cost the Congress a lot. And he used to get money from the Birlas and so on, and managed to keep together landholders, managed to keep together, socialists, everybody in the same tent, took being firmly in the center and sort of taking no extreme ideologies as far as possible. That is what made him an effective mass leader. Whereas Ambedkar, for example, could not be a mass leader. He was a very powerful intellectual because his position came from a much more extreme standpoint with good reason and with good logic for it. But that obviously was not tailored for the masses. You can't win over large sections of people who are so diverse and so divided by having an ideology that you're selling so strongly. So it's interesting how the two men evolved that way. And I agree with Amit, which is that, and this is lots of academics think. So Ambedkar, who was the most prominent and most interesting intellectual of that time, he did not write fancy prose like Nehru. He did not have Gandhiji's mass appeal. But if you think of originality of ideas, it was Ambedkar who was able to say some of the most polemical things and sharpen his message and really show us a mirror and show us our own ugly warts and tell us that the tyrant is not just the foreigner, the tyrant is also within.
Okay, there's just a barrage of questions coming in. What I love about doing these streams is that we are talking about this issue, and in the comments there's just a separate battle happening, which is always interesting to me, which is about allegations of censorship and all that stuff. It's always, and yeah, listen, I'm trying to get as many super chats as I can. I think so far Manu and Mohak have been very generous with their time, so I'll try and get as much as I can. Somebody's asked that I also want to get a question from a member. So Kajol Agarwal asks, and this is something related to what we just stumbled upon briefly, which is that why are the kings in Indian history shown as perfect human and compared to God? As example, Samudragupta from Gupta Empire. Can't we show kings and other people in history as humans rather than godlike? I think that's something which you anyway try and do.
I'm doing that.
Yeah.
Not many people like it, but yes, that's what we're trying to do. But one of the reasons also kings projected themselves very much as sort of semi-divine figures, because in those days, that's how kings managed to get people to respect them. If people realized that you were just flesh and bones like them, there was nothing special about you, your power was always insecure. And that's why if you look at temples and then you look at the palace, which is usually next to the temple, in the same city, often physically also the two dominions are sort of aligned with each other. The deity in the temple is treated like a king, which is you're woken up in the morning by people, with these musical instruments, you're taking on processions, grand festivals, you're dressed in jewelry, silks. The deity is treated like the king, and the king, for his part, is treated like a semi-divine figure. It is a constant sort of overlap between that religious power of the deity and the political power of the king, and they're constantly trying to nourish or live off each other's sort of aura, and they sort of join together at the hip as far as Indian kingship is concerned. So kings always projected themselves as super divine, amazing creatures who could do all kinds of supernatural things, partly because that was how kingly identity was formed. When the first, when Alauddin Khilji's people first came down to Devagiri in the Deccan, what's interesting is that many years before that, there was an inscription where the king of the Yadavas in Devagiri basically says that when his armies and he step out, the Turks are all quivering and shaking with fear. And this is before he's seen a single Turk in his life. He's just flaunting this idea because he knows somewhere in North India, Turks have come. People are talking about a lot of this, the chaos that they've caused. Therefore, I'm going to pretend that these people are scared even of me. And I'm such a superior figure. Whereas in reality, when the Turks actually end up coming, he's defeated. But that's how kings behave. And that's their form of public relations, just as today's kings and authoritarian leaders and political leaders have their own public relations campaigns. which is to make them look infallible and, constantly saying the right things and so on and so forth.
Okay, one more super chat question, and then I'll take one from Mohak. Hyperbole asks, there were many schools of thought that existed in India. Was there an atheist school of thoughts before Brahminical, Buddhist, and others became prevalent?
There is the whole Charvaka thing, right? In fact, I have a small book on Charvaka somewhere. I haven't read it yet. I'm not sure if this is it. There. Skepticism in Indian Thought, Charvaka Philosophy Re-Examined by Latika Chattopadhyay. It's a fairly short book, but I haven't read it yet. But yes, India does have an atheistic tradition. It's just a question of, it wasn't particularly influential and it sort of died out. So even the material we have is relatively small. Like we can't, people are still debating about what the Charvakas were all about. But there is a strong element, even within the Hindu fold, of that kind of atheistic belief.
Okay, Mohak, you have anything? Your volume
Sorry,
is
I'm on mute.
Yeah.
Again, Manu, this is probably a question that gets asked to you a lot, which is, so in an interview you said, you hate the fact that history gets, it makes you uncomfortable when history gets politicized, right? And that your job is to look at in as unbiased way as you can, but you have certain political or social beliefs, right? So when you go into this research process, and especially the writing process, there is one narrative or just a choice of words would reflect some of those beliefs, I'm guessing. So do you feel it, say when I make videos, my objective is to ideally bring the two sides together because there's so much political polarization. So, and I'm conscious of the word choice that I'll use. So for example, in my videos, I will never use the word bhakt because I want to bring those people who actually don't agree with me. And if I start name calling, that wouldn't get them onto my channel or watch my video. So do you see this writing process as with some social or political goal in mind? And so this is during the writing as well. And when, for example, in Bollywood movies, which is going through a history phase about a lot of historical epics are being made, there are lots of historical inaccuracies that a lot of historians have pointed out. Do you feel pressure that it's my duty to come out and correct it, or are you pretty unaffected by the politics around issues that you deal with every day?
Yeah, I mean, as far as films are concerned, I'm not particularly eager to get into that, battle and try and sort of issue clarifications and all that. Partly because, I mean, on the one hand, I understand filmmakers are playing with a completely different set of factors. They have to also appeal to the largest sort of audience and so on. So you can't expect super nuanced sort of readings of history from filmmakers. What you can expect is at least accuracy as far as facts are concerned. So, there was this movie on the Rani of Jhansi. And I found it rather sad that a woman who had so many layers, who was so interesting and intelligent, was reduced to spouting just 5 patriotic lines constantly throughout a 2-hour movie, when in reality, she was a remarkable woman. Before the 1857 rebellion, when the rebellion started, she did not immediately join. For nearly a year, she held out, and she was actually negotiating with the British. Now, what is interesting about that is the negotiations are fascinating because she had legal acumen that was extremely interesting. She was able to argue her case very much like a lawyer. She had assistance, of course, but we know that she herself was very involved in this, and she was capable of arguing a case very pointedly. It was when she was denied her claims despite putting forth a legal challenge, and then the company refused to sort of give her kingdom back. That's when she throws in her lot with the rebels. So for the first year, she was also sort of on the fence about whether or not to join them, which you don't get in the movie. In the movie, you say, oh my God, my nation, therefore I will fight. But these concepts did not exist then. There's this line where she goes in front of Scindia and she says, Deshdrohi. Deshdrohi was not a word they would use at that time to begin with. So those inaccuracies rankle a little bit. But as I said, filmmakers exist in their own universe. Book writers exist in their own universe. Of course, one has a greater impact on the public. People who read books are fewer than people who watch movies. But, I don't get too involved in it because then if you do, there's nothing else. You lose all your time focusing on that. But in general,
sorry, just to interrupt. I just came upon a thought which I think is kind of it's an interesting thought. So Neil deGrasse Tyson actually started getting more and more popular when he started sort of questioning the sort of scientific fallacies in a lot of sci-fi, and he was doing it purely just to sort of needle people a little bit and also to try and be humorous. Now the problem is that I don't know if you agree with this, which is that people are not, at least in India right now, we are way too sensitive about history to even have that little amount of needling happen. Like I can imagine you, if you go online and say that, hey, XYZ, this is sheet, blah, blah, blah. I can already imagine the comments, which is that, so you're not even allowed to have a point of view on history, which is not this thing to an extent. I don't know if you
To be
agree.
fair, a lot of that is orchestrated, which is to say
Yeah.
that I've realized that firstly, a lot of these trolls who come after you when you say something that is inconvenient or doesn't fit a preconceived idea, firstly, a lot of them are not genuine accounts. They just create this mobbing to make you feel like somehow you've been cornered. And I've realized in the last few years that a lot of this is just fake. It's not even real human beings. It's some of them, of course, real, and some of them are really poisonous. But a large number of them are just people who are liking and retweeting just to make you feel cornered, just to create that mentality in your head that somehow you're in this minority and you're completely sort of pushed to the wall and have to fight all these people. So I'm not increasingly I'm not very caught up in that kind of trolling or whatever. But yeah, I mean, I think that space is shrinking where people believe something, they hold on to that no matter what, which is sad because unfortunately that's not how the past worked out. And the story you mentioned the courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin. That second essay that I mentioned with the Maratha king. Now read that essay. Right? This is a Maratha king, Shivaji's nephew. So the first Maratha Chhatrapati's half brother's son. Only one generation away. He's this Maratha king in Tamil Tanjavur. His court language is Telugu. His generals are Rajputs and Bundelas and Afghans and so on. Again, multicultural universe. He writes somewhere in the early 18th century this parody of the caste system. What happens in it? There is a Brahmin called Moro Bhatlu the Magnificent. Moro Bhatlu is going for a temple festival with his chela, his disciple. Somewhere on the way, they see a beautiful woman in the distance. And the Brahmin says, oh, I want to go and flirt with her. And the disciple says, no, she's, you're a Shastri, think of the subtle meaning of Vedic words. And the man says, no, I don't want insipid eternal bliss. I want the bliss that comes with spending an evening with this lady. Now, once this happens, the Chela has no option but to go with this guru. Guru starts flirting with the lady. But when the lady turns around, she's an untouchable woman. She belongs to the leather worker caste. First, she says, oh, I'm untouchable. You can't have dealings with me. He says, no, these rules we Brahmins created. You don't bother about that. Then she says, oh, I'm married, so I can't have any dealings with you. Again, the Brahmin says, give me your loins as you would donate land to a Brahmin. That's fine. Finally, she says, we drink liquor and we eat beef, so we're not pure enough for you. And the Brahmin turns around and says, oh, I worship the mother cow and I drink her milk. You eat the whole cow, so you must be purer than me. Now, a line like that about eating beef and a Brahmin saying this to a Dalit woman in a parody written in the 18th century reflects a confidence that this Maratha king had in the 18th century to be able to say something like that. This play was actually performed in public for large audiences in a temple festival year after year. It was not just for his private entertainment. You can't say something like that today. If today somebody had a dialogue like that in a play, imagine the kind of ruckus it would cause, because people don't have the bandwidth to realize that it's fine. The greatest mark of cultural security is the ability to laugh at yourself, which we've lost. We've become so hypersensitive and so thin-skinned that we've lost the capacity to laugh at ourselves, to sort of take ourselves a little lightly. And I'm trying essentially through history to correct that and say that we should approach history seriously and we should understand it seriously, but we should not get over serious about this and think that somehow our culture is some rock that you have to put in a gilded cage and lock it and keep the key safely in your pocket, because that's not how culture evolves. Culture is constantly shaping itself. It's constantly drawing in nourishment from different sources. Culture is always evolving and breathing. And that's why Mohak's question on bias also comes in, which is that of course, all historians have biases. They all have their political views, etc. But as I said, there is an effort made to minimize that bias, which is that you go according to the material in a certain way. You get guided by the material. You can never say you've been 100% objective, but you can at least try and be 90% objective. That in the trying lies the real answer. In that attempting to be objective lies the answer. Whereas some people are not objective at all. They've decided that they want to use historical material purely to further a certain idea or further a certain preset agenda. That is where you're not even making the effort. And that is where the difference lies, which is that all historians have biases, but most formal or serious historians realize how to tackle that bias and minimize it to the extent possible.
All right, Divya Warrior asks, by the way, I have a lot of questions of my own. I had a whole thing written down here, but because people are asking a lot of questions, I'm just trying to be as sacrificial of my own questions as I can be. So Divya Warrior says, what should be inculcated in the history books in schools as per you, Manu? It seems that we miss out on a lot of things. School happens to be a molding phase and we should use that phase at its best.
I mean, I don't know. I don't have much faith in school textbooks, right? I mean, as I often say, textbook writers are given 50 pages or 100 pages and told, write Indian history in these pages. Now, how on earth are you supposed to condense a country as complicated as ours, spread over 3,000, 4,000 years into 100 pages? It's a very difficult ask to begin with. So, it was, textbook committees are therefore tempted to reduce it to the bare bones of history. 3 dates, 5 empires, 5 kings, and that's your Indian history for you. That's just how it is. I'm not sure how that can be rectified. And this is true not just of us, but a lot of school textbooks around the world. In the British system, they taught of the British Empire as some kind of great civilizing force around the world that spread democracy and wonderful things to the oppressed masses of the East. Whereas in reality, we know from experience that the British experience was slightly different. So textbooks are always lopsided. They will always be amended by governments. For me, the real answer lies in higher education, which is that once people come, say, into high school or 11th, 12th, and then onwards, that's where you need to really get them to read better stuff. To not necessarily Indian history as a whole. Give them one topic. Give them one topic they can understand inside out. Learn how to analyze it properly. Learn always to ask the question why. Always to ask questions of what you're told. We are not taught in our system to ask questions. We are taught in our system to digest and regurgitate. Like essentially, that is our system. It is always about learning, cramming, and then putting it all out on a sheet of paper. It's not about actually telling us how to think, about how to ask questions, how to sort of come to our own conclusions. So history can't be repaired in isolation. It is in the larger and broader context of changing education itself and making education more about turning out intelligent human beings rather than people who can write very good exam papers. I sucked in school. I was terrible at these exams. It was not my thing at all. And I'm not at all upset or embarrassed to say that I scraped through my 12th standard exams with 35 on 100 in German because it was not my thing. I was not at all a person built for writing exams. But that did not make me unintelligent. It's just, the system is somehow tailored sometimes in a way that allows people who have strong memories and cramming capacities to succeed, and people who don't have those skills to languish behind feeling depressed and in some extreme cases even taking their lives thinking that they are unable to cope with this. It's essentially a corrective in a broader sense rather than just in history.
This counters a statement that has been made in the chat. This is a normal chat that I'm reading. Indraneil Gokhale says, Manu's that student who always asks for extra answer sheets in exams within
Not
5
once.
minutes of beginning the test. So
Not once
that's
in my life.
completely not true.
Not
It's
true at
already
all.
been disproved.
Yeah.
Okay, one more question from Super Chat and then we'll go to Mohak again. Abhijit Balakrishnan asks, there is obvious Hindu cultural influence in Cambodia, Thailand or Indonesia. This may be because of a seafaring history. What keeps it obscure? It's not obscure. Is it
No, but
obscure at
again,
all?
I mean, I see what he means, which is again that we don't talk about it enough. As I said, the Angkor Wat is the greatest temple complex in the world of that size and scale. We don't learn of it as an ancient temple complex because it's not in our geography. A lot of what we think of ours is constrained by today's geography or today's maps rather than the larger understanding of the fact that people used to move around a lot. Globalization is a modern word, but the impulse of globalization is not at all modern. It's existed for thousands of years, and that's just how it is. And so what you find often is still about 1,000 years ago, there was what scholars call a Sanskrit cosmopolis, which is that Sanskrit was a trans-regional language of great prestige, which was valuable not just in India, but also in Southeast Asia. Like that, Sanskrit became the means by which a lot of this literature moved around. Then in the last 1,000 years, till 1835, Persian replaced it. So Persian and the Islamicate world, not Islam, but Islamicate, Persianate, that world started impacting a lot of Indian culture as well. As I said, stitched clothing, some of the foods we eat, all of this comes from that particular exposure. So Sanskrit, etc., did have its day when it was really mighty and powerful. Then it was replaced by Persian, and today we live in a world of English. English is the trans-regional language of the world. English is the language of global power. English is the language of movement and sort of global impulses. It's just how history sort of moves. We do. I mean, ideally, we should learn more about Southeast Asia, etc. As I said, if we learn more about South Indian kingdoms, we would learn more about it. For example, in the 8th century, the Pallavas in Kanchipuram discovered that the king had died and they didn't have heirs left anymore, and they realized that up in the family tree, a Pallava prince had gone and married somebody in Vietnam or Cambodia, one of those two places. So they basically send Brahmins on a ship. They go there, identify a 12-year-old descendant, bring him back, install him as Nandivarman, the next Pallava emperor. And this is a boy with Southeast Asian features, essentially. So again, when people say Mughals are foreigners because they came from outside, I'm sorry, we have a Pallava king also who came from Southeast Asia with a major proportion of his blood being Southeast Asian. Does that make all the subsequent Hindu Pallava kings of Kanchipuram foreigners? It doesn't. It's just that these boundaries did not exist. It made no difference at that time. They were part of that same cosmopolis in those days. So at that time, it made perfect sense. There was nothing jarring about bringing someone in from Southeast Asia because idhar bhi Sanskrit, udhar bhi Sanskrit. In both places, there was a certain common cultural identity they could fall back on. And that's, it was perfectly cool then. We, however, retrofit our current maps and our current insecurities to the past.
Awesome. Mohak, do you have anything?
I have. It was more on a recent topic on the Bloomsbury book incident. So, I mean, for context, for those who don't know, Bloomsbury, which is a global publisher, it came out with a book on Delhi riots, and they were organizing an event where Kapil Mishra was invited, and who's allegedly a key individual who led that his speech led to the riots. And so there was a backlash on social media about this event, and Bloomsbury then canceled the event, and then eventually, I think, canceled the book. And now the book has found a new publisher. And so one side was arguing, obviously, you can't allow like people who actually led to the riot to publish a book. The other side was it's freedom of speech, and like Atal Bihari Vajpayee's famous statement that "ek kitab ka jawab ek kitab se do." And I found myself torn in like what is actually the right way and like in this argument. So I wanted both again, Saurabh and Manu's opinion of like where do you stand on this opinion and that's shaped you? Yeah.
I mean, unless Saurabh wants to go first, I would simply say that I again, as you said, it's a very difficult subject on which to take a stand because it's so complicated, because it's mixed up with freedom of expression and what is pretty obvious is a collection of lies, and it seems to be the case at least. And in parts of it, we've seen online, etc., excerpts and bits like that, and it's really worrying that this kind of book was published at all without any fact checking, with all kinds of random blanket statements, etc. But equally, yeah, I agree that I find it a little disconcerting that it was pulped like that, because a few years ago you have that case of Wendy Doniger, whose book got pulped because a man sort of railed against it for several years and took them to court, etc. The publisher just decided we're not going to carry this. That book got published later again by somebody else. But if you're fighting a battle of principles, then it's difficult to be selective in the sense that let them publish the lies, it will be called out as lies. See, intelligent people who don't believe in lies are not going to buy that book anyway. It's going to be bought by another set of people who want to believe in those lies. Whether or not you pulp the book, it's still going to happen. But the difference is that this is not a ban. This was not a government intervention. It was basically public pressure brought to bear on the publisher, and the publisher decided, therefore, to pull out of the book. There is something to be said about that fact that basically public pressure is also a democratic force. It is also a democratic means of expressing disapproval of something. So when people lobbied and told Bloomsbury that, look, this is not something that we can respect, or this is something that's going to damage your credentials with us in future, any book you publish is going to be suspect because you've given a platform to something that is riddled with errors and a certain kind of propaganda that is deeply dangerous and vilifies a set of people. Bloomsbury took the decision. I think that is a perfectly reasonable argument to make. Everybody has a right to object. And then the publisher made his choice. The book has found another publisher as well. Nobody's banned the book. So in that sense, I'm willing to sort of allow it to that extent, which is that kind of thing is possible. It's possible for the public to make its voice heard and for people to sort of react accordingly. But all the same, yeah, I'm always a little wary of online mobs or online groups that make real life changes and have real life consequences like this, because firstly, it's a very, I don't know, it can be very myopic. If you live in the online universe, sometimes you think this is the state of the world, whereas the state of the world on the ground can sometimes be different. In terms of precedence, it's the same when people were toppling statues around the world, right? In England, in America, etc. and people say, oh, this is amazing, etc. But I find that deeply disturbing in an Indian context. We already have an example of a monument, a historical building being torn down violently, and a religious site now being built there. And for me, it sets a bad precedent. You allow it once, even with the best of intentions, it becomes a precedent. Tomorrow, you can never guarantee who's going to use it in a similar way for their own purposes. Again, the difference here is no government force was involved. This was not the government of India legislating to say this book can't be published. This was public opinion. It made its voice heard. The publishers decided to pull back from their engagement with that book. The book found another publisher. So I'm okay with that, but slightly sort of mixed as to how far I'm okay with that. I see the point, but I find it difficult to fully sort of jump onto that, because in future, this kind of thing can always be used in a negative way as well. And it can always sort of spiral out of control into the hands of even the wrong people. It's always easy to drum up noise on social media. So today it happened to a book. No matter how much I hate it, it could tomorrow happen to my book. What do I do then? If a lot of right-wingers, for example, right-wingers don't like something I wrote, and they coerce and force my publishers to withdraw, what am I supposed to do? So there are concerns like that. I won't say it's an easy decision to make, but such is the world. We are living in complicated times.
I mean, I was thinking about it, and I realized that Bloomsbury essentially screwed up. I mean, it's really simple. They essentially commissioned a book that they knew that they liked the topic of, and they in their heads they're like, hey, this is going to be a bestseller, and people are going to want to read it.
Apparently it was not commissioned. I think many publishing houses have this scheme where you pay them to publish a book. So essentially you put in the money and the book is published on the basis of that, and they distribute it. So it sort of gets the prestige of the publishing house, but the publishing house is not actually commissioned it. And there seems to be a case to be made that this book was like that, because one of the authors was asked forthright whether in an interview or something, whether this was a paid sort of thing, and she said, why does it matter? She didn't say yes or no. And that was slightly tricky. So it may have just been a commercial thing for Bloomsbury.
But I mean, that also shows you that the publishing industry is really struggling, where you just decide to accept like whatever $15,000 from pretty much anyone who wants essentially the printing press and the name. But in both sides, I definitely think, I mean, the thing is that Bloomsbury screwed up, and even everything that they did from like start to finish with regard to this was essentially reeking of a lack of communication. Even right now, the lack of clarity of why they said no. And I completely agree. I think like coming into pressure of a bunch of people, if you've decided to commission a book, is silly. But again, the problem is that it's like, where do they go? You know what I'm saying? Like they basically have all these authors who have decided that, okay, we are not going to be published with you. They decide to not publish the book. And then other authors who've already been commissioned are like, okay, you know what, we're not coming with you. So the whole situation is crazy, where the number, I definitely think that, that I think the publishers completely played this incorrectly from start to finish.
Yeah, but I do hope, that sometimes we also learn to ignore a few things, because look at that book, right? It would have, as I said, the particular constituency for which that book was written is not a constituency that generally reads books, firstly. It's not a constituency that reads books. So if that book had been ignored, it would have practically sunk without a trace. Like, as far as at least that's my theory, it would have sunk without a trace. It's the same like a tweet yesterday by a retired IPS officer where Swami Agnivesh dies, and he issues a tweet saying that good riddance, this man was whatever. A very vulgar, crude thing to do about a person who's just died. But frankly, this person is goading people. He's trying to get people provoked. The best answer there is to ignore it. It'll get its 300, 400, 5,000 tweets or whatever among a set of people. But if everybody gets riled up, it gets magnified to a completely different extent. And that then disseminates itself, and other people get inspired by it, realizing all you have to do is goad people a little bit. Not only will you get more followers, you'll start building up your own profile within a certain political faction and sort of grow your own agenda that way. So I think the people should not always be on the defensive when something comes up like this. Sometimes, I think it's also better to ignore and forget. And sometimes it's better to think more creatively and address these things. Always defending, always sort of reacting to it can be counterproductive in the long run. Always reacting actually helps the other party grow their own ideas and spread their own word a little bit.
There's in fact just last week a paper was published that I'm going to quote in a video soon, which proves that taking extreme positions on social media is great as an influencer. And that's not surprising. I mean, if you
Yeah.
talk about how democracy is great, like that's not interesting. But if you say how democracy is terrible,
Yeah.
that gets a lot of opinions. And
Yeah.
so this is just the great example of that. Like so, and it's like you see a lot of influencers now, both from different spectrums. Like people who gain sudden following, like they have to take extreme positions. Like
Yeah.
and it's because both the spectrum feed into this ecosystem. Like people are retweeting in support of you and in angst.
Yeah.
So that IPS officer, I'm sure like his followers must have exponentially increased because
Yeah.
the amount of attention he gathered.
Yeah, precisely. He got,
Yeah.
I suppose, what he wanted. And he's
Yeah.
going to keep doing it because clearly this works. People are going to keep getting riled up. It's going to get more of a wider sort of audience for whatever he writes, and that cycle will keep continuing. Whereas, frankly, if people just imagine now 4,000 people who are outraged, if they'd all just ignored it, it would have circulated within a set of people who are already predisposed to that particular political agenda, and it would have sort of been limited to that. It would not have grown into some kind of major issue if it had simply been ignored. I know it's not always easy because these are really vulgar and crude things. I was tempted to say something, but I decided not to because I sort of retweeted other people saying things, but I didn't think I should add to the din because that's what he wants. It's just it's not, again, these things are not easy. It's not easy to come to a decision with things like this. And frankly, it's just I always work better if I'm not even looking at social media for a good 8-9 hours in a day, because then your mind is also at greater, I don't know, it's in a better mood to be able to actually get something done in real life.
A trick on Twitter is to, instead of doing retweeting someone, you should take a screenshot and then post that.
Yeah, so no, I was retweeting his critics, not him.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Mohak, what do you think about this whole Bloomsbury situation? What do you think about what happened?
I mean, it's so complicated. Like like this so there's obviously there are a set of people that are associated with that book who you wouldn't consider to, like, whose views you probably would assume to be not something that should be published. At the same time, to come to make that conclusion without reading the book is also unfair. So where do you draw the line where that, like, I don't know. I mean, I'm so contrived in my head where, okay, they shouldn't find a publication house, as well as the fact that, hey, you haven't published, so at least publish first and then we form an opinion. So I don't have a great answer to that. So I don't know.
No,
Yeah,
so the basic thing, there's this book called How Democracies Die. It's written by two American authors, broadly based on America, not really applicable to much of the world. But the principles are sort of interesting, which is basically that one of the democracies don't die because one fine morning someone has a coup and they take over power. What happens is it sort of creeps up on you. One by one, the bar is lowered. And you get sort of constantly, because things get so negative that your own expectations go down. Your own expectations, how politicians need to behave, how states need to behave, all of that goes down. So one argument we made in favor of the people who objected to the book and managed to get it sort of deplatformed from a major publishing house is precisely this: that if the publishing house sets a precedent by publishing something like this, which is not fact-checked, which is ultra-biased, which has not gone through any kind of process where somebody sort of, checks whether all the claims stand up to scrutiny. It's on a case that is still being investigated. So how can you make all kinds of categorical statements, etc., etc.? It is important perhaps to do that because otherwise it sets a precedent. Once you allow a Bloomsbury to publish something that is of questionable provenance and quality, then tomorrow there's nothing to say that all publishers will think, acha, let's do this. They're already doing it to begin with, but why make it easier for them? So there is an argument to be made that, as I said, the public objecting and thereby getting the publisher to rethink is entirely legitimate, because I think it is the public voicing it. It can have dangerous ripple effects in that other people can also use it, including for books that don't perhaps deserve that kind of attention.
I'm not sure I agree with that. I think, I mean, the things that for whatever the fact checking based on, I think, and I listened to the same interviews that you did, where I think the forward was written by whoever, and that person, they said that the fact checking was on the basis of a forward that somebody wrote, not what we wrote, etc., etc. It just gets into this sort of whatever wormhole of contradictions across the board, But irrespective of what you think of them as authors or as whatever else, I think they, like, anyone should be able to write a book. And I still genuinely believe that you let them publish what they want and then have counters publishing what they want. I think the difference between a book and, say, a YouTube video, for example, there's propaganda and there is misinformation being spread on WhatsApp and YouTube on a regular basis. The difference is that it takes less time. That's all it is. That's just the difference between a book and a YouTube this thing. But I do think that I completely agree with kitab ka jawab kitab se do is where
No,
I
I
stand.
agree. I agree. But see, there are certain standards that are followed. So how does publishing work?
Right.
Now, for example, when I did Rebel Sultans, personally,
Yeah.
so of the 300 and something pages that are there, about 73 pages are notes. So every
Yeah.
source is clearly mentioned with a bibliography at the end. Then the manuscript was sent to people across the spectrum. So it was sent to a lay reader to give a lay reader's opinion. It was sent to an art historian because there is art material that's used. It was sent to a historian who does not work on the area but works on history generally, so his views. It was sent to an expert historian who does work on the area. And all of these are people from different fields, not necessarily the same political views, etc. A huge spectrum of people. Their feedback makes the book stronger. Now, within the right wing also, there are books that have come out like this. For example, recently
Right.
there was a first part of Vikram Sampath Savarkar, for example. If you look at the cover of Savarkar, one of the people who's given a quote for the book is Faisal Devji, who's a well-known scholar in Britain. So what it immediately tells you is that this book has gone through a process where even a professor who is not part of that particular political wing or leans towards them or whatever has read it and feels that this book does a pretty solid job of communicating what it's arguing. It's a pro Savarkar book, whatever, and that's perfectly fine. It's the author's prerogative. He gives his sources, he's done his research, he gives his sources, he tries to make an argument, and that's all fine. But that's the
Right.
thing, right? The book has to go through that process. When you're making something, when you're writing something on such a deeply divisive subject, I think the audience also deserves to know whether that book has actually gone through a certain process of fact checking and so on and so forth. When your
Right.
forward itself is riddled with certain inaccuracies and certain blanket claims and
Yeah.
allegations, it doesn't really inspire confidence in the book. And then people are perfectly at liberty to tell the publisher, your stock is going to fall in our mind if a
Right.
book like this gets published. Kitab ka jawab kitab hi hai, because that book did get published. Nobody prevented it from being published by the other publishing house. Because the
Yeah.
other publishing house is known to publish books like this. Perfectly fine.
Yeah.
What they're saying is a Bloomsbury is held up to different standards. A Bloomsbury, which publishes everything from J.K. Rowling to sort of William Dalrymple, that cannot get away by saying that we've not done our basic rigorous fact checking on a book like this.
Yeah, I think
It's complicated, as I said.
Yeah, it's very complicated. But I completely think that anybody's voice, no matter whether it's like misinformation or whatever it is. Okay. Because you can reply to it. Okay, we have a lot of crazy super chats piling up. Bhavneet Bhinder again says, "Can a historian ever be truly objective?" I think we pretty much answered that.
Yeah.
Arpit Midha says, "Okay, wait. There's a couple of things I just want to get through." Preeti Narayan has said, which is this is how far back we are in super chats. She said, "Manu Pillai's grandmother has stolen my heart. Great work, Saurabh. These are very informative and engaging streams." So we are way behind on where we are. Zoya Wahi is similar in her feedback. She says, "If history was taught like this in school, we'd all be so much better for it. This is such important context setting for our times and lives." Thank you. And Arpit Midha says, "Hi Manu, read your Rebel Sultans few months back. Loved it." He has a question which is about, can you please throw some light on Habshi kingdoms in India?
Habshi.
And how do you say it?
Habshi.
Habshi.
It comes from Abyssinia. Like basically that's a part of Africa. Habash. Habashi. Yeah.
Okay. So do you want to talk about
No, so
Habshi
yeah, so basically
kingdoms?
we often forget the African contribution to the construction of Indian history, which is that, and it's not just in the Deccan Sultanates, even Razia Sultan in Delhi, one of the reasons her courtiers plotted against her was because she was over fond of an Ethiopian, commander or a friend or whatever, supposedly a lover. Another was this, if you go to Ahmedabad, there's this historic mosque which was constructed by an African grandee. In Bengal, at one point, briefly, there were Africans in power. In Jaunpur in Uttar Pradesh for about a century, and people in Jaunpur, I'm sure, are not particularly aware that they were ruled by black people about 6 centuries ago. Deccan is, of course, the most remarkable place because this is where you have the most heroic of these Africans in India, which is Malik Ambar in the early 17th century, and that's a remarkable man because he's essentially in the 1560s. He's the slave who's brought from. He's essentially as a 12-year-old picked up from Africa from the Oromo tribe, taken to Baghdad, sold over there, lands up in India, where he's purchased by the Peshwa of Ahmednagar. Peshwa is essentially the prime minister. But the Peshwa himself is a black man to begin with. He owns about 1,000 black slaves himself, and these are military slaves. We're not talking about American type slavery on plantations or in a menial sense. These are warriors, these are fighters. And they're brought in specifically because they are not connected to the country. They don't have cultural links to the country. Therefore, they will be loyal to their patron. So for the king, having foreign mercenaries as his royal guard is always better because he can trust them implicitly because he's the one who feeds them. Whereas if he depends on his nobility, they can plot and they have all kinds of reasons to talk with him. So Malik Ambar comes. For the longest time, he's just a minor player, a minor warlord with a few hundred people behind him. Then the Mughals invade the Deccan, and in that vacuum that is created, in the shifting sands of that time, his numbers start increasing. From 300, it becomes 1,000, it becomes 7,000, goes on to 20,000. And most of these people are not just Africans, but also Marathas. So Malik Ambar becomes the leader of the Maratha faction in the Deccan. And this is several generations before Shivaji. In fact, one of Malik Ambar's close comrades was a man called Maluji Bhosle, who was Shivaji's grandfather. And Shivaji's father was also well known to Malik Ambar. And Malik Ambar, for about 25 years, 25, 27 years, he becomes this wall between the Mughal Empire and the conquest of the Deccan. The one thing that stands between them is this man who manages to get the support of the Deccan Sultanate. Sometimes they also party with the Mughals and try to screw him over, but broadly he succeeds. And there's this famous painting where Jahangir is, sort of shown with a bow and arrow taking aim at Malik Ambar's head, which is already impaled on a spear. This was Jahangir essentially fantasizing in art what he could not achieve in real life, which was the destruction of Malik Ambar. And Malik Ambar actually died a very old man, comfortable in his fortress and very powerful. And what is interesting is that while we don't talk enough about Malik Ambar, he's the one who originally develops the guerrilla warfare that would become very popular with Shivaji and the Marathas subsequently. They would take it to levels of perfection, but the original template is sort of designed by Malik Ambar, who uses the Deccan's geography and light attacks on these heavy Mughal armies that come in. Swift, quick attacks, he'll come in and attack them and demoralize them and disappear. Now, what is interesting is that while we don't talk enough about the Habshi contribution, we don't talk enough about Malik Ambar and people like him, in Shivaji's own time, a lot of respect was paid to him. So when Shivaji becomes a king in the 1670s, he commissions a Sanskrit poem called the Shiva Bharata, in which a lot of praise is bestowed on Malik Ambar, in which Malik Ambar is compared to Kartikeya, the Hindu god. He's considered as brave as the sun. Shivaji's sort of grandfather and father are sort of eulogized for their, sort of closeness to him. Malik Ambar is seen very much as an integral part of Deccan history / Indian history at that time. In that century in which he lived, he was a hero in the Deccan, including for Shivaji. But again, the way history evolves subsequently is that we don't talk about the African contribution anymore. When we do, it's usually only in the 19th century context of some of the black begums of the Nawab of Awadh or the black bodyguards of the Nizam of Hyderabad. We forget the earlier links. And the earlier links are also interesting because in all probability, their blood merged with our blood. In the sense that when these Africans came, unlike the Persians, etc., who came and had cultural links back home, had their wives, children, or whatever, these men had no links back to Africa. So they would marry local women. And in a few generations, blend completely into local society. And it's not all that surprising. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, when the last king of Burma was exiled to Ratnagiri in Maharashtra, just as the last Mughal emperor was sent to Burma in exile, the Burmese king was sent to India in exile. One of his daughters, these poor princesses had no friends. They were locked up in this, practically under house arrest in this palace in Ratnagiri. No associations with other Burmese, nothing. One of the princesses starts having an affair with the watchman, a man called Savant, who's a Maratha. And she has a love child with this Maratha man, whose name is Tutu, but she also prefers her Maratha name of Baisubai. And Baisubai ends up marrying a Pawar, who's a bus driver or something. And her children are practically Marathas today. In feature, in dress, in name, other than the fact that their grandfather or great-grandfather was the Burmese last king of Burma, they are practically Maharashtrianized. And if you looked at them, you would not really be able to tell that Baisubai was actually half Burmese and of a royal descent combined with a Maratha, because very quickly societies can absorb these foreign elements like this. So a lot of people in Western India, probably the Indian peninsula itself, probably have African blood and don't realize it.
Wow. I remember reading about Malik Ambar in your books also. It says quite a detailed thing. Shekhar Khere asks if the British did not come to India, who would have ruled India? Uh,
It's
this
a
is,
naughty
yeah,
counterfactual, but
yeah,
I wrote an essay on this once, not to give an answer on who would have ruled India, but just to
yeah,
puncture the idea that what we think would have happened in India may not have happened. Firstly, that
yeah,
if people thought if the British had not come, Sanskrit would have been some kind of glorious language we were still using. The three of us would be having this conversation in Sanskrit, for example. Not true, because till 1835, as I said, Persian was the language that was used for diplomacy across India. So even in Kerala, when the Malayali Queen of Travancore wrote to the governor of the British in Madras, it was in the Persian language, not in English, not in Malayalam, in Persian, because Persian was considered the language of pan-Indian diplomacy at that time. So for all you know, if the British had not come, we would be having this conversation in Farsi, not in English or any other Indian language. Another thing is, if the French could have dominated the South Indian peninsula, the Marathas came very close to dominating much of the north, and they retained the irony is, although Shivaji came up fighting the Mughals, the Marathas later sort of co-opted the Mughals and kept the Mughals as a figurehead to sort of stamp all of their expansions and conquests. And perhaps we would have had a North India dominated by Marathas with the Mughal emperor as some sort of a figurehead ruler. And we know in 1857, it was still not an obscure idea to resurrect the Mughal emperor as the leader of all Hindustan. And the South may well have been, francophone, because if Tipu Sultan's alliance with the French had worked out, the French at one point had even kicked out the British from Madras. It was the settlement of peace in Europe that made the French give Madras, etc., back to the English in India. But if the French had dominated the peninsula, for all you know, the southern India might have been a francophone country, where the Mysoreans, etc., would have been very powerful. And we know Tipu Sultan wanted to import Western technology through the French into South India, etc. He had his own solid expert engineers, etc. So the map we have now would not have existed. It would have been a rather different country, possibly in two, three large pieces rather than one solid chunk as we know it now. But again, these are just speculations. It's just keeping the factors that existed in the 18th century when the British rose. One can sort of speculate and say that perhaps this is what might have happened.
yeah. The what ifs never end, right? Because it's like, what if this, then also what if that, and then what if
Yeah.
eventually you're just like, there's a massive
Yeah, you
bubble.
can't. It's as I said, it's a naughty venture to do counterfactuals. It's not something historians are advised to do. I just did it for fun in a couple of cases for my own
Yeah.
entertainment and published them.
Yeah. Okay. There's one question from Raghu K. I want to ask this question and then I want to go to Mohak again. Raghu K asks, did breast tax had an impact on not wearing a blouse? Is there something called a breast tax?
There was in Kerala, but it's hugely misunderstood, which is that
Right.
people think that lower caste women had to pay a tax in order to be able to cover their breasts, which is simply not true because nobody covered their breasts. Upper caste women sometimes threw on a loose shawl, but not with the intention of covering themselves. It was thrown on in the
Right.
same way that men did. It was worn as a caste privilege, not as a modesty thing for women. Men and
Yeah.
women, whenever they came across God or a superior in a temple or etc., they had to take off their upper cloth, even if you were an upper caste person, even if you were a Brahmin lady. If you enter a
Right.
temple, even now when Malayali men enter temples, you have to take off your shirt because you cannot go into God's presence wearing a shirt or covering yourself like that. Back in the day, till the 1920s, even women took off whatever they were wearing on top to enter a temple. That was the norm there. The breast tax story basically says lower caste women were not allowed, only lower caste women were not allowed, and therefore, if they wanted to cover themselves, they had to pay a certain tax, and that was based on the dimensions of the breast, etc. Completely fake, because basically lower caste people were sometimes charged a poll tax. For men, it was called head tax, and to distinguish the rate women paid, it was called breast tax. In certain places, there was no such distinction. It was simply called head tax or talapanam. In some places, there was a distinction between men and women. That is why, other than nomenclature, the breasts have nothing to do with that tax. It was just a tax charged on lower caste people. And unfortunately, this is that Victorian gaze. So we think that preventing women from covering their breasts must have been an insulting thing. It was not. Till the 19th century, it was not an insulting thing in Kerala because nobody did. And the people who did wear a shawl wore it as a caste privilege, not as a modesty thing or a matter of pride. So even when there were these riots where lower caste women from the Nadar community converted to Christianity and they start dressing like the upper caste women wearing that shawl, the compromise was that they were free to cover themselves with blouses, but they should not wear the cloth because the cloth was a caste privilege. Wear a blouse, nobody cares. Like wear a blouse, wear a shirt, that is not the issue. The issue is you cannot imitate the upper caste person's cloth. because as we discussed earlier, your clothes gave away to the public what your exact caste position was. So if people started tampering with how people dressed, you were upsetting the entire caste order. And you have this in the official records also, where the Maharaja says that, long-standing usages on caste, if castes cannot distinguish each other, there will be disorder, and therefore you cannot tamper with clothes, and the upper core cloth of the upper caste women cannot be worn by, or upper caste women and men cannot be worn by lower castes.
Manu, you really need a podcast or a YouTube channel.
I already sleep very few hours. I'm not going to buckle to this pressure.
No, I was reading some of your.
Yeah, so
Go
just
ahead,
one
Saurabh.
second, which is that please, we're going to end in about 10 minutes. I think this has already been about 2 hours, and both Manu and Mohak has been very, very generous with time.
What to say? You inspire generosity.
Yeah, see, I'm a king of my own domain of this YouTube channel. So just keep liking the show so that more people tune in and all the rest of that nonsense. And again, I'm just going to mention that this continues on Tuesday and all the rest of that stuff. We're going to do 10 minutes more and then we're going to get out of here. Mohak, please ask your questions, ask your comments, whatever it is.
Just on your, I think on your book being turned into a web series, right? Ivory Throne. Yeah, do you have anything interesting? How many beheadings and like dismembered bodies?
No, Ivory Throne has no dismembered bodies. It's about two of these matrilineal Maharanis in Kerala who were sort of fighting for power in the 20th century. And that is really the story of the Ivory Throne. They're all plotting against each other in, subtly, more subtly than lopping people's heads off. But it's a very dramatic universe. It's of course set in Travancore, and that's the other thing, right? The matrilineal tradition is really heightened when it comes to these royal families, because royal families also live with a lot of protocol, and that's where you realize that matrilineal, while it did not give women equality with men, it often gave them a lot of authority and power. It was not a completely fair system, but it was less unfair than patriarchy. And in the matrilineal system, because protocol comes in, my own family is matrilineal. So, for example, traditionally, when your father passes away, you don't do the rites. His sister's children have the first right. His own son has no right. In fact, when parents passed away, we have this ritual pollution, right? For a certain number of days, you're not supposed to go to a temple, etc. That does not apply to a man's children, because a man's children belong to the mother's family. The wife and children are a separate family from the father. The father belongs to his sisters and his mother's family. So the matrilineal system is not a relationship, is not between husband and wife as such. It's brother and sister. That is what is a family unit. Brother, sister, sister's children. That constitutes a family unit. Now, the matrilineal royal families, this created a very interesting situation where the husbands of the queens were not royalty. They were just men who were called consorts. And they were brought in essentially to father the next generation of royal children for the princesses. And then otherwise they had no royal status. So, for example, in the royal family of Cochin, they were Kshatriyas, and the princesses used to choose Brahmin husbands. And the Brahmin husbands used to get 6 rupees or 8 rupees per month as their pay for the services as consorts. And if they were from ordinary Brahmin families, they were paid 6 rupees. If they were from exalted Nambudiri Brahmin families, they were paid 8 rupees. Till, of course, the story goes, somebody complained to the Maharaja that you cannot have 2 rates of pay for men performing the same job. And then everybody was upgraded to 8 rupees a month. In Travancore, which was a wealthier royal family, the husbands used to get 200 rupees a month, meals from the palace, accommodation, but nothing else. And maybe income tax exemption and freedom from gun licenses. But even the income tax exemption only came in the 1910s. Before that, the husbands had to pay income tax to their own wives' families because the husbands were not considered royalty. Husbands were not permitted to sit in the presence of their wives in public. They had to remain standing unless they were specifically asked to sit. They could not refer to their wives by name. They had to call them Your Highness. There was no question of calling your wife her first name. That was simply not possible. When the husbands died, their own wife and children, who were royalty, would not attend the funeral because he may be their husband, he may be their father, but he's still a private citizen of the state, and royalty does not attend the functions of private citizens of the state. So the Maharaja's father, when he dies, the Maharaja does not attend because his father is inferior to him in status. Even in banquets, while the Maharani served 4 varieties of dessert, her husband gets only 2 because that's the status given to the husbands. And I know this even from a non-royal family like mine, which is that the stories are just remarkable of women, the way they sort of kept their husbands in their place, how the husbands sometimes had all kinds of grievances. My great-great-grandfather often felt slighted in his wife's house, and his standard techniques, he used to have this huge four-poster, carved canopy bed, and he used to sort of lie there like some badsha with these bolsters and cushions and all that. And anytime his wife slighted him by essentially pointing out that he was living off her money and her land, he would summon his nephews. They would lift him with the cot and take him to his house across the fields, and he would sit there for a few days. And then the children would go and say, no, come back. We'll treat you better this time. And then he would come back, and again he would stay for 6 months. Again he would then fight and go back to his place. And it was just how it was. And today's Kerala, people don't even realize some of these nuances and details, where even the wording that was used. So the Cochin royal women, their husbands were simply called not husbands, which is Bhartav in Malayalam. They were called Iruppugar. Iruppu means to sit. So these are basically men who sit in the palace, and then they're summoned to their wives whenever their services are required. And that is that. In Travancore, the Ranis used to choose their husbands. The protagonist of the Ivory Throne, Setu Lakshmi Bai, who's the last Maharani, she was basically taken to a balcony, shown a brother, an older brother and a younger brother, and told, you choose whichever one you liked, and whichever one you like. And she said, okay, I like the younger, more teenage character. So she chooses him. Now, obviously, in those days, they have to check horoscopes and all that. It's very simple. Once the queen has decided who she wants, it is the job of the astrologer to make the horoscopes match. He cannot come back and then say horoscopes don't match. It is his job to make it match. If it does not match, do the pujas or whatever to make it match. Then the husbands are given all kinds of training: how to sit on a horse, how to hold your cutlery, how to dress, even sex education. So much for a society that has issues with sex education today. The priest, the family priest called Kakatapoti, used to give sex education to the Rani's husband, because when you make love to a princess, there are certain things you do and there are certain things you cannot expect or do yourself. So all of that training was given. And in the early months and years of the marriage, custom was that even when they made love, when the husband went to the wife's bedchamber, was determined by when Venus and Shani and all these things are the right sort of spaces in the universe. And based on that, so that to ensure that the child born of the union is of the right kind, even that is policed, and even that is heavily sort of checked. And this is not, some of this is entertaining, it's comical, but there's also deeper substance to this. Since we're ending, I'll just end with one final story, again from Kerala. We live in a time of Me Too, and women are talking up, and we're learning about systemic sort of biases and problems in workplaces and so on. What is interesting is in 1905, there was this case in Kerala of a lady called Kuriyada Tatri. She was a Nambudri Brahmin woman. Nambudri Brahmin women were the only women in Kerala who were in Parda. They were not given a proper education. Not even Muslim women were in Parda. They were the only women who were not given freedom. They used to spend most of their lives in the four walls of their homes. And they were highly policed. They were not allowed to be seen by other men. On the face of it, it's an impossible life. But then this woman, at the age of 23, she's found committing adultery. And there's this huge trial that is conducted. And they think, and she says, no, the man also has to be tried. So they say, fine, we'll try the man also. Except that she produces a list of some 65 or 66 men who she's had affairs with in these 23 years of her existence. And it's a remarkable case because for the first time, the highest caste in the land, there's a woman, and she's kept records. So she knows these men are given a chance to interrogate her, and they come and deny that they had they'd even met her. And she says, no, on that day when there was that festival in this particular temple, that's where we met. You, I met in the veranda near the south block of the house. You, I met after that Kathakali performance in next to the bathing tank. She'd have exact locations and places for everything. She even remembered what bodily marks they had, where they had a mole, whether they had a wart on the thigh. All of these things were remembered. And great, like oaks of Kerala society fell in the process. Brahmins, a famous Kathakali actor who was considered a star in those days called Kavungar Shankara Panikar, Mahoots, people of all kinds of castes and backgrounds, which basically tells you that this woman in a Nambudri family where everything is supposedly policed somehow managed to carry on with these 66 men. Not all of it was willingly. The first case was when she was 10 years old. Her future brother-in-law sexually abused her. So even for people who say sexual abuse in India is because of Western exposure, not quite true. I mean, we have a case at least in the 19th century of a woman being sexually abused when she's a child. That happened. And eventually, of course, she's excommunicated and thrown out. But the story is remarkable. 65, 66 men falling in this particular case. And the story goes that, two of these men had died. So when she came to the 64th name, the Raja of Cochin said, enough with this case. It's too scandalous. We're not going to discuss it anymore. And the story goes that his name was the next, which is why he stopped the case right there and then. And it's remarkable because all of Indian history, you find these subtle details which are always about standing up to things. If we often think that our ancestors were somehow always obeying the rules of society and, with bhakti, following everything they were told to follow, not quite true. There's these memoirs written by a Nambudri woman called Devaki Nilayangod, and she talks about how they were not allowed to read, they were not allowed education, etc. But every month when the women had their periods, they would have to sit in a segregated space. There was a separate room where the women would sit, and no men would come there during the time when they were considered defiled or impure. That is when they used to read. That is when they used to read their newspapers. That is when they used to read their magazines. That is where they used to read their books. But they were also Brahmin women who thought that, we cannot make Saraswati, because the book is Saraswati, Ashuddh by touching her when we have our periods. So they would get maid servants to come and turn the pages for them. I mean, imagine at the hub of a patriarchal family, in a place where you're sitting, where you're supposedly Ashuddha because of your period, you're managing to consume all this contraband literature without your fathers and brothers even realizing. It's the height of resistance. Indian history is full of stories like this of women and men who've always been able to stand up and ask inconvenient questions, which is why, in today's world, when people have this, we must protect culture. If you don't protect culture, you're against the nation, etc. I'm sorry, our culture is to always ask inconvenient questions. It has never, ever, in no century has India not seen some figure or the other who's not stood up and sort of challenged the status quo. There have always been people who've asked those difficult questions.
Okay, lots of Noob Master 69. See, this is a normal comment I'm reading. Saurabh जोर सी लगी है पर एग्जाम अभी चालू हुआ first 5 minutes में कैसे washroom के लिए पूछूं? I don't know what this statement is. I just found it entertaining for whatever it means. Okay, lots of super chats.
Exam.
Yeah. Oh, that way. Acha, yeah. But you can take. I mean, you're not in the Zoom. You can go do susu whenever you want. Varsha R, thank you so much. I love your books, Manu. She said, I have attended a lot of your talks. Must admit the authenticity of it. I don't know how to speak words. Vetis Jepa, thanks a lot for your super chat. Sai Krishna, thanks for your super chat. Govind the Keshav Das, I really appreciate it. I'm sorry we're running out of time right now because I think both Mohak and Manu have to leave. Thanks a lot, Govind Keshav Das. Thank you, Tushan Jha, for your second question. Oh, two questions. Amazing guy. Ajitab Avasthi. Also Ascension Talks. Also Nirmala Menon. Manu Pillai, you're clearly a good teacher. I love your pedagogy-like style. I don't know what that means, but good.
I actually just taught my first classes last month, the first time in my life. It went well. So yeah, I take this as a compliment.
There you go. Nitesh Rao, thanks. Yash Purohit, thank you. Itu Rat says, big fans of your 3 streams, Saurabh. Appreciate the diversity of experts across all panels. Thanks, man. I appreciate that too. Sushmit Takavekar, thanks a lot. Hyperbole, once again, you're a hero as always.
Wait, you're a hero or like Mohak or me? Who's the hero?
Everybody involved is a hero. Anybody who watches this or is involved in this is a hero, is in my mind. Extremely average also says a question. I'm sorry, we're running out of time, so don't put any more super chats, but I'm just reading out your names because you guys have been so kind. PK, thank you so much. Let's take this last question from Viranchi Deshpande. Okay. Saurabh, I'm deeply hurt by these supposedly vague statements of right-wingers not reading books. Appropriation to this extent is not right. I don't think anybody said that right-wingers don't read books. Did we imply that? I completely don't agree with that.
I may have implied it in a different sense, which is that when we were talking about the Bloomsbury book, where I said that, the book would not even have reached a large audience because it was intended for a certain audience, it would have stayed within that particular audience. Because of the brouhaha that was sort of created, it sort of received a sort of attention all over the place. But, whether right-wingers read books or not, I suppose, can be debated. I know for a fact that many of them don't read my books. So coming from my experience, I stand by my remarks.
So Manu basically is trying to clarify that they don't read his books. So it's a
and they're free to read whatever
choice.
books they want.
Yeah. But I think a lot of right-wingers read and are well-read and what is the word? Abreast of things. There are lots of I have people who I talk to fairly often on a series of things. But when I say right-wingers, I'm obviously talking about the troll variety that you see on Twitter, not the thoughtful kind where you can actually have a discussion, even correct some of your own views and biases that might exist. And, as we discussed earlier, it's not like any of us are free of bias. It's always a work in progress where you're trying to pull back the layers and
trying to sort of get rid of your own filters.
So, like the stream, subscribe to it. I will make a couple of announcements after Manu and Mohak leave. Mohak, anything to plug? Anything that's coming up? Any last parting thoughts? Please go ahead. Both of you, anything you'd like to say, please feel free.
No, thank you. I mean, this was great. And yeah, Manu, the offer still stands. Please start a podcast or a YouTube channel. I'm sure a lot of viewers would love that. Like, I've heard a couple of your podcasts, and it's amazing. So great to speak to you finally. And thanks, Saurabh, for organizing this.
Thanks, Saurabh. And, it's
No,
fun to be here and good to, speak to Mohak directly. We've had email exchanges before and, I've seen him on video, but good to actually have a conversation for once. But I don't think I'm going to start a podcast or a video series anytime soon. But thank you for the idea. And
maybe you can do a voiceover in the TV series that's coming on your book.
When it happens. These things take so long, if and when it happens, but I'm not getting involved in that. As I said, I know my skill set. I'm happy to stick to that for the time being. Life is always about these tempting opportunities coming. And, if you stick your finger in too many pies, then, you spoil everything. So it's better to stick to what I know well and do that well enough.
Super. I will give a plug. Please subscribe to Mohak on Soch. He's got a very nice channel. I really enjoy his work. And Manu has a lot of books: The Ivory Throne, The Rebel Sultans, The Courtesan, the something else. I know it ends with Italian Brahmin. That's the one I'm reading right now. It's genuinely quite a nice read. So please pick up either of those 3 books and follow them on Twitter and follow them everywhere. Thanks a lot, guys. Thank you, Mohak. Thank you, Manu. Thanks a lot for being very generous with your time. Almost 2.5 hours. Really appreciate it. A couple of things I want to announce. You guys can bounce. I just have to announce some like future things that are coming up and all the rest of that stuff.
Thanks, Saurabh, and thanks
a lot,
and
guys.
Thanks to everybody for watching. Bye.
Thank you, guys. Okay, just to tell you, Tuesday is the first episode of Wake Up with the IPL, where I'm getting comedians and non-comedians to talk about cricket and the IPL. First episode is Mr. Bassi, Shrija, and Gaurav Gupta are going to be there on Tuesday at 11 o'clock. We're going to talk about cricket and pretend not to understand 90% of the things. Shrija doesn't watch cricket that much, so it's going to be fun. Thursday, we have Aishwarya Mohan Raj, Sonali Thakkar, and Pavitra Shetty. That's also going to be fun. Saturday, we have Lieutenant General Zamiruddin Shah, who is a retired gentleman, and he was a vice chancellor of AMU, aside from having a pretty distinguished career in the armed forces. So that's happening on Saturday at 11 o'clock. Fun lineup coming up. Again, you can become a member. I will try and read as many things as I can. Membership, again, you can check out. See, I spoke about membership and my laptop almost fell. 3 levels of membership. Level 1 gives you badges and gives you emojis and all the rest of that stuff and just allows you to support whatever I'm doing. Level 2 is where you get all the benefits of level 1 as well as a YouTube live stream once a month with members. Level 3 is for besties and best friends, where all the benefits of level 1 and level 2, along with that, you also get 2 comedy open mics per month. So if you're interested in any of that stuff, please go ahead and become a member. If you don't, that's absolutely fine. Just keep watching, keep liking, keep telling more people about what we're doing, and keep tuning in. I want to thank all my mods as usual. Kajol Agarwal, Sharania wasn't there. What today? Sharania wasn't there, I think. And all the members and all the rest of that stuff. I'm sorry I couldn't take all the super chats. I tried my level best, but there's a lot of people to come through. I think somebody at the end said that Bharat Aswal says, I feel weirdly attracted to Manu. Man, no worries there. Nothing weird about it. Cool. I will see you guys on Tuesday at 11 o'clock. And again, there's a new channel with snippets on it. So go check that out. Keep this podcast running if you enjoyed it and couldn't do super chat on InstaMojo and PayPal. Guys, thanks a lot for tuning in, man. Really appreciate it. I'll see you guys. Have a good Monday. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. And thanks a lot once again to Manu S. Pillai and Mohak Mangal for the time. Goodbye, friends.